Please subscribe our channel Crystal Audiobooks to get updated on every new audiobook we upload and hit the like button. Thank you. Only the paranoid survive. Sooner or later, something fundamental in your business world will change. I'm often credited with the motto, only the paranoid survive. I have no idea when I first said this, but the fact remains that, when it comes to business, I believe in the value of paranoia. Business success contains the seeds of its own destruction. The more successful you are, the more people want a chunk of your business and then another chunk and then another until there is nothing left. I believe that the prime responsibility of a manager is to guard constantly against other people's attacks and to inculcate this guardian attitude in the people under his or her management. The things I tend to be paranoid about vary. I worry about products getting screwed up, and I worry about products getting introduced prematurely. I worry about factories not performing well, and I worry about having too many factories. I worry about hiring the right people, and I worry about morale slacking off. And, of course, I worry about competitors. I worry about other people figuring out how to do what we do better or cheaper, and displacing us with our customers. But these worries pale in comparison to how I feel about what I call strategic inflection points. I'll describe what a strategic inflection point is a bit later in this book. For now, let me just say that a strategic inflection point is a time in the life of a business when its fundamentals are about to change. That change can mean an opportunity to rise to new heights. But it may just as likely signal the beginning of the end. Strategy inflection points can be caused by technological change, but they are more than technological change. They can be caused by competitors, but they are more than just competition. They are full-scale changes in the way business is conducted, so that simply adopting new technology or fighting the competition as you used to may be insufficient. They build up force so insidiously that you may have a hard time even putting a finger on what has changed, yet you know that something has. Let's not mince words, a strategic inflection point can be deadly when unattended to. Companies that begin a decline as a result of its changes rarely recover their previous greatness. But strategic inflection points do not always lead to disaster. When the way business is being conducted changes, it creates opportunities for players who are adept at operating in the new way. This can apply to newcomers or to incumbents, for whom a strategic inflection point may mean an opportunity for a new period of growth. You can be the subject of a strategic inflection point, but you can also be the cause of one. Intel, where I work, has been both. In the mid-80s, the Japanese memory producers brought upon us an inflection point so overwhelming that it forced us out of memory chips and into the relatively new field of microprocessors. The microprocessor business that we have dedicated ourselves to has since gone on to cause the mother of all inflection points for other companies, bringing very difficult times to the classical mainframe computer industry. Having both been affected by strategic inflection points and having caused them, I can safely say that the former is tougher. I've grown up in a technological industry. Most of my experiences are rooted there. I think in terms of technological concepts and metaphors, and a lot of my examples in this book come from what I know. But strategic inflection points, while often brought about by the workings of technology, are not restricted to technological industries. The fact that an automated teller machine could be built has changed banking. If interconnected inexpensive computers can be used in medical diagnosis and consulting, it may change medical care. The possibility that all entertainment content can be created, stored, transmitted, and displayed in digital form may change the entire media industry. In short, strategic inflection points are about fundamental change in any business, technological or not. We live in an age in which the pace of technological change is pulsating ever faster, causing waves that spread outward toward all industries. This increased rate of change will have an impact on you, no matter what you do for a living. It will bring new competition from new ways of doing things, from corners that you don't expect. It doesn't matter where you live. Long distances used to be a moat that both insulated and isolated people from workers on the other side of the world. But every day, Technology narrows that moat inch by inch. Every person in the world is on the verge of becoming both a co-worker and a competitor to every one of us, much the same as our colleagues down the hall of the same office building are. Technological change is going to reach out and sooner or later change something fundamental in your business world. Are such developments a constructive or a destructive force? In my view, they are both. And they are inevitable. In technology, whatever can be done will be done. We can't stop these changes. We can't hide from them. Instead, we must focus on getting ready for them. The lessons of dealing with strategic inflection points are similar whether you're dealing with a company or your own career. If you run a business, you must recognize that no amount of formal planning can anticipate such changes. Does that mean you shouldn't plan? Not at all. You need to plan the way a fire department plans. It cannot anticipate where the next fire will be, so it has to shape an energetic and efficient team that is capable of responding to the unanticipated as well as to any ordinary event. Understanding the nature of strategic inflection points and what to do about them will help you safeguard your company's well-being. It is your responsibility to guide your company out of harm's way and to place it in a position where it can prosper in the new order. Nobody else can do this but you. If you are an employee, sooner or later you will be affected by a strategic inflection point. Who knows what your job will look like after cataclysmic change sweeps through your industry and engulfs the company you work for? Who knows if your job will even exist and, frankly, who will care besides you? Until very recently, if you went to work at an established company, you could assume that your job would last the rest of your working life. But when companies no longer have lifelong careers themselves, how can they provide one for their employees? As these companies struggle to adapt, the methods of doing business that worked very well for them for decades are becoming history. Companies that have had generations of employees growing up under a no-layoff policy are now dumping 10,000 people onto the street at a crack. The sad news is, nobody owes you a career. Your career is literally your business. You own it as a sole proprietor. You have one employee, yourself. You are in competition with millions of similar businesses, millions of other employees all over the world. You need to accept ownership of your career, your skills, and the timing of your moves. It is your responsibility to protect this personal business of yours from harm and to position it to benefit from the changes in the environment. Nobody else can do that for you. Having been a manager at Intel for many years, I've made myself a student of strategic inflection points. Thinking about them has helped our business survive in an increasingly competitive environment. I'm an engineer and a manager, but I have always had an urge to teach, to share with others what I've figured out for myself. It is that same urge that makes me want to share the lessons I've learned. This book is not a memoir. I am involved in managing a business and deal daily with customers and partners, and speculate constantly about the intentions of competitors. In writing this book, I sometimes draw on observations I have made through such interactions. But these encounters didn't take place with the notion that they would make it into any public arena. They were business discussions that served a purpose for both Intel and others' businesses, and I have to respect that. So please forgive me if some of these stories are camouflaged in generic descriptions and anonymity. It can't be helped. What this book is about is the impact of changing rules. It's about finding your way through uncharted territories. Through examples and reflections on my and others' experiences, I hope to raise your awareness of what it's like to go through cataclysmic changes and to provide a framework in which to deal with them. As I said, this book is also about careers. As businesses are created on new foundations or are restructured to operate in a new environment, careers are broken or accelerated. I hope this book will give you some ideas of how you can shepherd your own career through these difficult times. Let's start by parachuting into the middle of a strategic inflection point, when something is changing in a big way, when something is different, yet when you're so busy trying to survive that the significance of the change only becomes clear in retrospect. Painful as it is, let me relive the story of a problem that Intel had with our flagship device, the Pentium processor, in the fall of 1994. Something changed. New rules prevailed now, and they were powerful enough to cost us nearly $500 million. I teach a class, Strategic Management, at Stanford University's Business School as a part-time departure from my job as President and CEO of Intel Corporation. The way my co-taker, Professor Robert Berg-Elman, and I normally grade the students is to go through the class roster right after each session and assess each student's class performance while it is still fresh in our memories. The process was taking a little longer than usual on the morning of November 22, 1994, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and I was about to excuse myself to call my office when the phone rang. It was my office calling me. Our head of communications wanted to talk to me urgently. She wanted to let me know that a CNN crew was coming to Intel. They had heard of the floating point flaw in the Pentium processor and the story was about to blow up. I have to backtrack here. First, a word about Intel. Intel in 1994 was a $10 billion plus producer of computer chips, the largest in the world. We were 26 years old, and in that period of time we had pioneered two of the most important building blocks of modern technology, memory chips and microprocessors. In 1994, most of our business revolved around microprocessors, and it revolved very well indeed. We were very profitable, growing at around 30% per year. 1994 was a very special year for us in another way. It was the year in which we were ramping our latest generation microprocessor, the Pentium processor, into full-scale production. This was a very major undertaking involving hundreds of our direct customers, i.e., computer manufacturers, some of whom enthusiastically endorsed the new technology and some of whom didn't. We were fully committed to it, so we were heavily advertising the product to get the attention of computer buyers. Internally, we geared up manufacturing plants at 4 different sites around the world. This project was called Job 1, so all our employees knew where our priorities lay. In the context of all this, a troubling event happened. Several weeks earlier, some of our employees had found a string of comments on the Internet forum where people interested in Intel products congregate. The comments were under headings like, "Bug in the Pentium FPU." FPU stands for Floating Point Unit, the part of the chip that does the heavy-duty math. They were triggered by the observation of a math professor that something wasn't quite right with the mathematical capabilities of the Pentium chip. This professor reported that he had encountered a division error while studying some complex math problems. We were already familiar with this problem, having encountered it several months earlier. It was due to a minor design error on the chip, which caused a rounding error in division once every 9 billion times. At first, we were very concerned about this, so we mounted a major study to try to understand what once every 9 billion divisions would mean. We found the results reassuring. For instance, they meant that an average spreadsheet user would run into the problem only once every 27,000 years of spreadsheet use. This is a long time, much longer than it would take for other types of problems which are always encountered in semiconductors to trip up a chip. So while we created and tested ways to correct the defect, we went about our business. Meanwhile, this Internet discussion came to the attention of the trade press and was described thoroughly and accurately in a front-page article in one of the trade weeklies. The next week it was picked up as a smaller item in other trade papers. And that seemed to be it. That is, until that Tuesday morning before Thanksgiving. That's when CNN showed up wanting to talk to us, and they seemed all fired up. The producer had opened his preliminary discussion with our public relations people in an aggressive and accusatory tone. As I listened to our head of communications on the phone, it didn't sound good. I picked up my papers and headed back to the office. In fact, it wasn't good. CNN produced a very unpleasant piece, which aired the next day. In the days after that, every major newspaper started reporting on the story with headlines ranging from "Flaw undermines accuracy of Pentium chips" to "The Pentium proposition, to buy or not to buy." Television reporters camped outside our headquarters. The internet message traffic skyrocketed. It seemed that everyone in the United States keyed into this, followed shortly by countries around the world. Users started to call us asking for replacement chips. Our replacement policy was based on our assessment of the problem. People whose use pattern suggested that they might do a lot of divisions got their chips replaced. Other users we tried to reassure by walking them through our studies and our analyses, offering to send them a white paper that we wrote on this subject. After the first week or so, this dual approach seemed to be working reasonably well. The daily call volumes were decreasing, we were gearing up to refine our replacement procedures and, although the press was still pillorying us, all tangible indicators from computer sales to replacement requests showed that we were managing to work our way through this problem. Then came Monday, December 12th. I walked into my office at 8 o'clock that morning, and in the little clip where my assistant leaves phone messages there was a folded computer printout. It was a wire service report. And as often happens with breaking news, it consisted only of the title. It said something to this effect: IBM stops shipments of all Pentium-based computers. All hell broke loose again. IBM's action was significant because, well, they are IBM. Although in recent years IBM has not been the power they once were in the PC business, they did originate the IBM PC, and by choosing to base it on Intel's technology, they made Intel's microprocessors preeminent. For most of the 13 years since the PC's inception, IBM has been the most important player in the industry. So their action got a lot of attention. The phones started ringing furiously from all quarters. The call volume to our hotline skyrocketed. Our other customers wanted to know what was going on. And their tone, which had been quite constructive the week before, became confused and anxious. We were back on the defensive again in a major way. A lot of the people involved in handling this stuff had only joined Intel in the last 10 years or so, during which time our business had grown steadily. Their experience had been that working hard, putting one foot in front of the other, was what it took to get a good outcome. Now, all of a sudden, instead of predictable success, nothing was predictable. Our people, while they were busting their butts, were also perturbed and even scared. And there was another dimension to this problem. It didn't stop at the doors of Intel. When they went home, our employees had to face their friends and their families, who gave them strange looks, sort of accusing, sort of wondering, sort of like, "What are you all doing? I saw such and such on TV and they said your company is greedy and arrogant." Our employees were used to hearing nothing but positive remarks when they said that they worked at Intel. Now they were hearing deprecating jokes like, "What do you get when you cross a mathematician with a Pentium? A mad scientist. And you couldn't get away from it." At every family dinner, at every holiday party, this was the subject of discussion. This change was hard on them, and it scarcely helped their spirits when they had to go back the next morning to answer telephone hotlines, turn production lines on their heads and the like. I wasn't having a wonderful time either. I've been around this industry for 30 years and at Intel since its inception, and I have survived some very difficult business situations, but this was different. It was much harsher than the others. In fact, it was unlike any of the others at every step. It was unfamiliar and rough territory. I worked hard during the day, but when I headed home I got instantly depressed. I felt we were under siege, under unrelenting bombardment. Why was this happening? Conference room 528, which is located 20 feet from my office, became the Intel war room. The oval table there is meant to seat about 12 people, but at several times each day more than 30 people were jammed in the room, sitting on the credenza, standing against the wall, coming and going, bringing missives from the front and leaving to execute agreed upon courses of action. After a number of days of struggling against the tide of public opinion, of dealing with the phone calls and the abusive editorials, it became clear that we had to make a major change. The next Monday, December 19th, we changed our policy completely. We decided to replace anybody's part who wanted it replaced, whether they were doing statistical analysis or playing computer games. This was no minor decision. We had shipped millions of these chips by now, and none of us could even guess how many of them would come back, maybe just a few, or maybe all of them. In a matter of days, we built up a major organization practically from scratch to answer the flood of phone calls. We had not been in the consumer business in any big way before, so dealing with consumer questions was not something we had ever had to do. Now, suddenly, we did from one day to another, and on a fairly major scale. Our staffing first came from volunteers, from people who worked in different areas of Intel: designers, marketing people, software engineers. They all dropped what they were doing, sat at makeshift desks, answered phones and took down names and addresses. We began to systematically oversee the business of replacing people's chips by the hundreds of thousands. We developed a logistics system to track these hundreds of thousands of chips coming and going. We created a service network to handle the physical replacement for people who didn't want to do it themselves. Back in the summer, when we had first found the floating point flaw, we had corrected the chip design, checked it out very thoroughly to make sure the change didn't produce any new problems, and had already started to phase the corrected version into manufacturing by the time these events took place. We now accelerated this conversion by canceling the usual Christmas shutdown in our factories, and speeded things up even further by pulling the old material off the line and junking it all. Ultimately, we took a huge write-off to the tune of $475 million. The write-off consisted of the estimates of the replacement parts plus the value of the materials we pulled off the line. It was the equivalent of half a year's R&D budget or 5 years' worth of the Pentium processor's advertising spending. And we embarked on a whole new way of doing business. What happened here? Something big, something different, something unexpected. For 26 years, every day that we did business, we decided what was good and what wasn't when it came to our own product. We set our own quality levels and our own specifications, and shipped when we decided a product met our own criteria. After all, we had designed and conceived these products, and along with the product came our implicit right and obligation to decide when the product was good and when it wasn't. Nobody ever questioned that we had the right to do that, and generally we were on target. Over 26 years, we pioneered one classic product after another: DRAMs, other types of memory chips, microprocessors, computers on a board. Our products had become the basic building blocks of digital electronics. But now, all of a sudden, we were getting strange looks from everyone that seemed to say, "Where do you get off telling us what's good for us?" Furthermore, since we generally don't sell microprocessors to computer users but to computer makers, whatever problems we had in the past, we used to handle with the computer manufacturers, engineer to engineer, in conference rooms with blackboards, based on data analyses. But now, all of a sudden, 25,000 computer users were calling us every day, saying, "Give me a new part, period." We found ourselves dealing with people who bought nothing directly from us yet were very angry with us. What was the hardest to take was the outside world's image of us. I still thought of us as a creative, dynamic startup that had just grown a bit bigger than the other creative, dynamic startups. We could still turn on a dime. Our people still put the interests of the company ahead of their own interests, and, when problems arose, employees from all different divisions would still rally around and put in incredible hours without anyone ordering them to do so. Yet now the world seemed to treat us like some typical mammoth corporation. And, in the public view, this corporation was giving people the runaround. That outside image didn't jibe with my view of us. What had happened? And why now? What was different this time? Something was, but in the middle of those events it was hard to tell what. What happened to us a year or so later? As I reflect on it, I see two big long-term forces doing their work on us, creating the conditions in which a tiny flaw in a microprocessor's floating point unit could mushroom into $500 million worth of damage in less than 6 weeks. The first involved our attempting to change how our products were perceived. A few years back, we had introduced a major marketing campaign, the Intel Inside program. It was the biggest campaign the industry had ever seen. In fact, it ranks up there with big-time consumer merchandising campaigns. Its aim was to suggest to the computer user that the microprocessor that's inside his or her computer is the computer. Like all good merchandising campaigns, this had the advantage of reinforcing the truth. Even before the campaign, when you asked someone what kind of a computer he had, the first thing he tended to say was, "I have a 386-, which was the microprocessor chip inside the computer," and then he would go on to identify the computer manufacturer, what kind of software it had, and so on. Computer users knew instinctively that the identity and class of the computer were determined more than anything else by the microprocessor within. This was obviously very good for us. It gave us distinction and identity, and helped build computer user community's awareness of us and our products. We aimed our campaign at driving this point home to a wider consumer base and to future computer buyers. We created a distinctive logo, and we worked with manufacturers who used our microprocessor in their product to display this logo in their advertising, often with a sticker on the actual computer. Hundreds of manufacturers, domestic and international, participated in this campaign. We spent a lot of money ourselves promoting this brand. We had billboards displaying the Intel Inside logo all over the world, and we ran television commercials in many languages. We had even distributed many thousands of Intel Inside bicycle reflectors in China. By 1994, our research showed that our logo had become one of the most recognized logos in consumer merchandising, up there with names like Coca-Cola or Nike. So when problems developed with our flagship Pentium chip, our merchandising pointed the users directly back to us. The second fundamental factor in creating the conditions for the maelstrom was our sheer size. Over the years, we had become the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. We surpassed the large United States producers, companies we used to consider mammoth and gigantic compared to us just a few years ago, and we surpassed the major Japanese producers who just 10 years ago had threatened to put us out of business. More about that in Chapter 5. And we were still growing faster than most large companies. We had also become bigger than most of our customers, companies that I remembered from more earlier years at Intel to be monumentally large corporations. At some point along the way, like a kid who suddenly looks down at his father, our sizes reversed. This all happened relatively rapidly, in the past decade. And although the recognition of our size fleetingly touched us here and there, largely through the respect we got from other companies in our business, it was hardly something any of us dwelled on. It crept up on us, it just happened. And now we were dealing with a different and not nearly as pleasant consequence of our huge size and our strong identity. We had become gigantic in the eyes of computer buyers. Unfortunately, it took a blow-up to make us realize this. Given the gradual nature of these changes, which over time added up to a very large change, the old rules of business no longer worked. New rules prevailed now, and they were powerful enough to force us into actions that cost us nearly $500 million. The trouble was, not only didn't we realize that the rules had changed, what was worse, we didn't know what rules we now had to abide by. Before this episode, we supplied our computer manufacturer customers well, and we guarded the quality of our products as best we knew how. We marketed our products both to the engineers of these computer companies and to computer users. We were fast and agile, as all good startups are. We worked hard and everything had worked well in return. But all of a sudden this no longer seemed to be enough. What happened to us in the course of this event is something that happens to many businesses. All businesses operate by some set of unstated rules, and sometimes these rules change, often in very significant ways. Yet there is no flashing sign that heralds these rule changes. They creep up on you as they crept up on us, without warning. You know only that something has changed, something big, something significant, even if it's not entirely clear what that something is. It's like sailing a boat when the wind shifts on you, but for some reason, maybe because you are down below, you don't even sense that the wind has changed until the boat suddenly heels over. What worked before doesn't work anymore. You need to steer the boat in a different direction quickly before you are in trouble, yet you have to get a feel of the new direction and the strength of the wind before you can hope to right the boat and set a new course. And the tough part is that it is exactly at times like this that hard and definitive actions are required. Such phenomena are very common. Businesses are about creating change for other businesses. Competition is about creating change, technology is about creating change. The appearance and disappearance of regulations cause further changes. Sometimes these changes affect only a company, other times they affect an entire industry. So the ability to recognize that the winds have shifted and to take appropriate action before you wreck your boat is crucial to the future of an enterprise. That guy is always the last to know. In the 3 months following the Pentium floating point incident, Microsoft's new operating system, Windows 95, was delayed. Apple delayed the release of their new software, Copland. Long-standing bugs in both the Windows Calculator and Word for Macintosh were highlighted with substantial publicity in trade newspapers, and difficulties associated with Disney's Lion King CD-ROM game and Intuit's tax programs all became subjects of daily newspaper coverage. Something changed, not just for Intel but for others in the high-tech business as well. I don't think this kind of change is a high-tech phenomenon. Examples from industries of all different kinds stare at me from daily newspapers. All the turbulent actions of investments, takeovers, and write-offs in the media and telecommunications companies, as well as in banking and healthcare, seem to point to industries in which something has changed. Technology has something to do with most of these changes only because technology gives companies in each of these industries the power to alter the order around them. If you work in one of these industries and you are in middle management, you may very well sense the shifting winds on your face before the company as a whole and sometimes before your senior management does. Middle managers, especially those who deal with the outside world, like people in sales, are often the first to realize that what worked before doesn't quite work anymore, that the rules are changing. They usually don't have an easy time explaining it to senior management, so the senior management in a company is sometimes late to realize that the world is changing on them and the leader is often the last of all to know. Here's an example. I recently listened to evaluations of a certain highly touted new software from a company whose other products we already use. Our head of information technology told of unanticipated obstacles we were running into by trying to adopt this new software and therefore said that she was inclined to wait until the following generation of software was ready. Our marketing manager had heard of the same situation at other companies as well. I called up the software company's CEO to tell him what I was hearing and asked, "Are you considering changing your strategy and going directly to the new generation?" He said, "No way." They were going to stay the course. They had heard of no one having any problems with their strategy. When I reported this to the individuals who brought me the news, our IT manager said, "Well, that guy is always the last to know. He, like most CEOs, is in the center of a fortified palace, and news from the outside has to percolate through layers of people from the periphery where the action is. Our IT manager is the periphery. Our marketing manager also experiences the skirmishes there. I was one of the last to understand the implications of the Pentium crisis. It took a barrage of relentless criticism to make me realize that something had changed and that we needed to adapt to the new environment. We could change our ways and embrace the fact that we had become a household name and a consumer giant, or we could keep our old ways and not only miss an opportunity to nurture new customer relationships but also suffer damage to our corporate reputation and well-being. The lesson is, we all need to expose ourselves to the winds of change. We need to expose ourselves to our customers, both the ones who are staying with us as well as those that we may lose by sticking to the past. We need to expose ourselves to lower-level employees, who, when encouraged, will tell us a lot that we need to know. We must invite comments even from people whose job it is to constantly evaluate and critique us, such as journalists and members of the financial community. Turn the tables and ask them some questions about competitors, trends in the industry and what they think we should be most concerned with. As we throw ourselves into raw action, our senses and instincts will rapidly be honed again. A10X change. What such a transition does to a business is profound, and how the business manages this transition determines its future. We managers like to talk about change, so much that embracing change has become a cliché of management. But a strategic inflection point is not just any change. It compares to change the way Class 6 rapids on a river, the kind of deadly and turbulent rapids that even professional rafters approach gingerly, compared to ordinary waters. We just saw what it's like to be in the middle of a strategic inflection point. Now I'd like to step back and analyze what might cause one. The 6 forces affecting a business. Most analyses of the competitive well-being of businesses are static ones. They describe the relevant forces at any instant in time and help explain how they add up to favorable or unfavorable business positions. But they are of little help when a major change is taking place in the balance of these forces. For instance, traditional competitive analysis doesn't much help us understand the workings of a business when one of these forces grows, say, tenfold in magnitude. Still, these analyses have provided a good way of describing the factors affecting businesses. Let me start by quickly paraphrasing classical competitive strategy analysis, largely based on the work of Professor Michael Porter of Harvard University, who identified the various forces that determine how competitive a company is. Generations of business people and business students have been trained to think in terms of these forces, so I'll adopt them as our starting point. Porter describes 5 forces that determine the competitive well-being of a business. In my paraphrasing, they are the power, vigor, and competence of a company's existing competitors. Are there a lot of them? Are they well funded? Do they clearly focus on your business? The power, vigor, and competence of a company's suppliers. Are there a lot of them, so that the business has plenty of choices, or are there few of them, so that they have the business by the throat? Are they aggressive and greedy, or are they conservative and guided by the long view toward their customers? The power, vigor, and competence of a company's customers. Are there a lot of them, or is the business dependent on just 1 or 2 major customers? Are the customers very demanding, perhaps because their business operates under cutthroat competition, or is their business more gentlemanly? The power, vigor, and competence of a company's potential competitors. These players are not in the business today, but circumstances could change and they might decide to come in. If so, they may be bigger, more competent, better funded, and more aggressive than the existing competitors. The possibility that your product or service can be built or delivered in a different way. This is often called substitution, and I've found that this last factor is the most deadly of all. New techniques, new approaches, new technologies can upset the old order, mandate a new set of rules, and create an entirely new climate in which to do business. This is what trucking and air transportation have done to railroads, what container shipping has done to traditional ports, what superstores have done to small shops, what microprocessors continue to do to computing, and what digital media might do to entertainment. Recent modifications of competitive theory call attention to a 6th force, the force of complementers. Complementers are other businesses from whom customers buy complementary products. Each company's product works better or sometimes only works with the other company's product. Cars need gasoline, gasoline needs cars. Computers need software, software needs computers. Complementers often have the same interests as your business and travel the same road. I think of them as fellow travelers. While your interests are aligned, your products support each other. However, new techniques, new approaches, new technologies can upset the old order and change the relative influence of the complementers or cause the path of fellow travelers to diverge from yours. These 6 forces are sketched out in the diagram below. 6 forces diagram Rama 10X force. When a change in how some element of one's business is conducted becomes an order of magnitude larger than what that business is accustomed to, then all bets are off. There's wind and then there's a typhoon, there are waves and then there's a tsunami. There are competitive forces and then there are super competitive forces. I'll call such a very large change in one of these 6 forces a 10x change, suggesting that the force has become 10 times what it was just recently. This is illustrated in the following diagram. 6 forces diagram with a ox force. When a business goes from the condition shown in the first figure to the second, the changes it faces are enormous. In the face of such 10x forces, you can lose control of your destiny. Things happen to your business that didn't before. Your business no longer responds to your actions as it used to. It is at times like this that the telling phrase "something has changed" is apt to come. To manage a business in the face of a 10x change is very, very difficult. The business responds differently to managerial actions than it did before. We have lost control and don't know how to regain it. Eventually, a new equilibrium in the industry will be reached. Some businesses will be stronger, others will be weaker. However, the period of transition depicted in the diagram below is particularly confusing and treacherous. Transition between 2 states of a business. Now, nobody will ring a bell to call your attention to the fact that you are entering into such a transition. It's a gradual process. The forces start to grow and, as they do, the characteristics of the business begin to change. Only the beginning and the end are clear, the transition in between is gradual and puzzling. What such a transition does to a business is profound, and how the business manages this transition determines its future. I like to describe this phenomenon as an inflection point. The strategic inflection point. What is an inflection point? Mathematically, we encounter an inflection point when the rate of change of the slope of the curve, referred to as its second derivative, changes sign, for instance, going from negative to positive. In physical terms, it's where a curve changes from convex to concave, or vice versa. As shown in the diagram, it's the point at which a curve stops curving one way and starts curving the other way. The inflection curve. So it is with strategic business matters, too. An inflection point occurs where the old strategic picture dissolves and gives way to the new, allowing the business to ascend to new heights. However, if you don't navigate your way through an inflection point, you go through a peak, and after the peak the business declines. It is around such inflection points that managers puzzle and observe, things are different. Something has changed. Put another way, a strategic inflection point is when the balance of forces shifts from the old structure, from the old ways of doing business and the old ways of competing, to the new. Before the strategic inflection point, the industry simply was more like the old. After it, it is more like the new. It is a point where the curve has subtly but profoundly changed, never to change back again. When exactly does a strategic inflection point take place? It's hard to pinpoint, even in retrospect. Picture yourself going on a hike with a group of friends and getting lost. Some worrywart in the group will be the first one to ask the leader, "Are you sure you know where we're going? Aren't we lost?" The leader will wave him away and march on. But then the uneasiness over lack of trail markers or other familiar signs will grow, and at some point the leader will reluctantly stop in his tracks, scratch his head and admit, not too happily, "Hey, guys, I think we are lost." The business equivalent of that moment is the strategic inflection point. But if it's hard to tell in retrospect exactly where a strategic inflection point occurred, how can you tell while going through one? In fact, participants who live through one develop a sense of it being an inflection point at different times, just as the group of hikers suspected they were lost at different moments. The arguments in the midst of an inflection point can be ferocious. If our product worked a little better or it cost a little less, we would have no problems, one person will say. And he's probably partially right. It's just a downturn in the economy. Once capital spending rebounds, we'll resume our growth, another will say. And he's probably partially right. Yet another person comes back from a trade show confused and perturbed, and says, "The industry has gone nuts. It's crazy what people use computers for today." He hardly gets a lot of serious attention. So how do we know that a set of circumstances is a strategic inflection point? Most of the time, recognition takes place in stages. First, there is a troubling sense that something is different. Things don't work the way they used to. Customers' attitudes toward you are different. The development groups that have had a history of successes no longer seem to be able to come up with the right product. Competitors that you wrote off or hardly knew existed are stealing business from you. The trade shows seem weird. Then there is a growing dissonance between what your company thinks it is doing and what is actually happening inside the bowels of the organization. Such misalignment between corporate statements and operational actions hints at more than the normal chaos that you have learned to live with. Eventually, a new framework, a new set of understandings, a new set of actions emerges. It's as if the group that was lost finds its bearings again. This could take a year or a decade. Last of all, a new set of corporate statements is generated, often by a new set of senior managers. Perhaps more than getting lost on a hike, working your way through a strategic inflection point is like venturing into what I call the valley of death, the perilous transition between the old and the new ways of doing business. You march in, knowing full well that some of your colleagues will not make it across to the other side. Yet the senior manager's task is to force that march to a vaguely perceived goal in spite of the casualties, and the middle manager's responsibility is to support that decision. There is no other choice. Ideas about the right direction will split people on the same team. After a while, everyone will understand that the stakes are enormously high. There will be a growing ferocity, determination, and seriousness surrounding the views the various participants hold. People will dig in. These divergent views will be held equally strongly, almost like religious tenets. In a workplace that used to function collegially and constructively, holy wars will erupt, pitting co-workers against co-workers, long-term friends against long-term friends. Everything senior management is supposed to do: define direction, set strategies, encourage teamwork, motivate employees. All these things become harder, almost impossible. Everything middle management is supposed to do: implement policy, deal with customers, train employees, also becomes more difficult. Given the amorphous nature of an inflection point, how do you know the right moment to take appropriate action, to make the changes that will save your company or your career? Unfortunately, you don't. But you can't wait until you do know. Timing is everything. If you undertake these changes while your company is still healthy, while your ongoing business forms a protective bubble in which you can experiment with the new ways of doing business, you can save much more of your company's strength, your employees, and your strategic position. But that means acting when not everything is known, when the data aren't yet in. Even those who believe in a scientific approach to management will have to rely on instinct and personal judgment. When you're caught in the turbulence of a strategic inflection point, the sad fact is that instinct and judgment are all you've got to guide you through. But the good news is that even though your judgment got you into this tough position, it can also get you out. It's just a question of training your instincts to pick up a different set of signals. These signals may have been out there all along, but you may have ignored them. The strategic inflection point is the time to wake up and listen. The morphing of the computer industry. Not only has the basis of computing changed, the basis of competition has changed too. Of all the changes in the forces of competition, the most difficult one to deal with is when one of the forces becomes so strong that it transforms the very essence of how business is conducted in an industry. There are plenty of historic examples, such as how railroads revolutionized transportation, and many contemporary ones, such as how small retailers are being wiped out by superstores. The lessons and the dynamics of what happens seem to be the same, no matter what the industry, no matter where it is located, and no matter which era it operates in. I would like to describe how this all works by going in detail through an example that's close to my heart. When computers could be built around a simple commonly available microprocessor and, consequently, the personal computer appeared on the scene, it brought with it a cost-effectiveness that was easily 10 times greater than was available with the type of computing that preceded it. In a little over 5 years, the cost adjusted by performance decreased by 90%, an unprecedented rate of decline. Such an enormous change in the way computing could be done had profound consequences on the computing business. Before the strategic inflection point, the computer industry used to be vertically aligned. As shown in the diagram that follows, this means that an old-style computer company would have its own semiconductor chip implementation, build its own computer around these chips according to its own design and in its own factories, develop its own operating system software, the software that is fundamental to the workings of all computers, and market its own application software, the software that does things like accounts payable or airline ticketing or department store inventory control. This combination of a company's own chips, own computers, own operating systems and own application software would then be sold as a package by the company's own salespeople. This is what we mean by a vertical alignment. Note how often the word own occurs in this description. In fact, we might as well say proprietary, which, in fact, was the byword of the old computer industry. The old vertical computer industry circa 1980. A company competed in this industry as one vertical proprietary block against all other computer companies' vertical proprietary blocks. Salesmen would show up and offer their vertical combination of things, and the company they were selling to would decide to buy one proprietary line and not the others. This arrangement had its pluses and minuses. The pluses were that, when a company developed its own chips, its own hardware and its own software, sold and serviced by its own people, all the parts would be made to work together as a seamless total. The minuses were that, once you bought into this proprietary arrangement, you were stuck with it. If there was a problem, you couldn't throw out just one part of the vertical stack, you would have to abandon the entire stack, and that was a big deal. So customers of vertical computer companies tended to stay for a long time with the solution they chose in the first place. Needless to say, competition for the first sale was ferocious in the extreme, because whoever won that sale had the long-term advantage. This was how business was done for decades. Then the microprocessor appeared, followed by the 10X-force of the personal computer built on it. The 10X-force came about because technology now permitted putting what before had been many chips on one single chip, and because the same microprocessor could be used to produce all kinds of personal computers. As the microprocessor became the basic building block of the industry, the economics of mass production kicked in and manufacturing computers became extremely cost-effective, making the PC an enormously attractive tool in both home and business settings. Over time, this changed the entire structure of the industry and a new horizontal industry emerged. In this new model, no one company had its own stack. A consumer could pick a chip from the horizontal chip bar, pick a computer manufacturer from the computer bar, choose an operating system out of the operating system bar, grab one of several ready-to-use applications off the shelf at a retail store or at a computer superstore and take the collection of these things home. Then he or she fired them up and hoped that they would all work together. He might have trouble making them work, but he put up with that trouble and worked a bit harder because for $2,000 he had just bought a computer system that the old way couldn't deliver for less than 10 times the cost. This was such a compelling proposition that he put up with the weaknesses in order to avail himself of the power of this new way of doing business. Over time, this changed the entire structure of the computer industry, and a new horizontal industry, depicted below, emerged. The new horizontal computer industry circa 1995. In this diagram, we have horizontal bars representing fields of both competence and competition. In chips, suppliers of microprocessors using the Intel microprocessor architecture compete with companies such as Motorola and others who supply different types of microprocessors. In computers, a basic computer design is supplied by a variety of computer manufacturers, such as Compaq, IBM, Packard Bell, Dell, and many others. These computers are fundamentally similar even if the computer company engineers improve the basic machine as they compete with each other. In operating systems, again, there are a few well-established types. Over most of the decade of the 80s, Microsoft's early operating system, DOS, prevailed. In the 90s, this was modified to become easier to use and Windows emerged, which competes with IBM's OS/2, Apple's Mac OS and a number of Unix-based operating systems. A visit to a neighborhood computer store shows all sorts of application software competing for shelf space as well as for customers, spreadsheets, word processing, database packages, calendar software and the like. Sales and distribution of computer products have also become enormously eclectic. Retail stores compete with dealers who compete with superstores. Each of these carries a number of manufacturers' computers and software vendors' products, just as many grocery stores carry different brands of toothpaste. So, throughout the decade of the 80s, the way computing was done changed, from the old vertical way to the new horizontal way. First individuals using computers changed to PCs, then big-time computing increasingly started to be done this way. Over time, the entire structure of the industry metamorphosed to a horizontal structure, as shown on the next page. Even in retrospect, I can't put my finger on exactly where the inflection point took place in the computer industry. Was it in the early 80s, when PCs started to emerge? Was it in the second half of the decade, when networks based on PC technology started to grow in number? It's hard to say. But some facts are clear. Going into the 80s, the old computer companies were strong, vital, and growing. IBM projected that they would be a $100 billion company by the end of the decade. But by the end of the 1980s, many large vertical computer companies were in the midst of layoffs and restructuring, and a whole new set of players emerged. I keep thinking of a computer-generated image of a person morphing from one face to another, one face imperceptibly dissolving and another simultaneously taking shape. You can't tell the precise point when the first face disappears and the new face replaces it. You only know that at the beginning of the process you have one face and at the end of the process you have another face, but you can't identify any point where the image is any more one than the other. So it was here, even in retrospect. The transformation of the computer industry. As this transformation progressed, companies that had become prosperous in the old vertical computer industry found their lives increasingly difficult. But at the same time, the new order provided an opportunity for a number of new entries to shoot into preeminence. Compaq became the fastest Fortune 500 company to reach $1 billion in revenue. They were a company that understood the dynamics of the new industry and prospered by tailoring their business model to it. So did many others, like Dell and Novell. More about these later. After the strategic inflection point. Not only had the basis of computing changed, the basis of competition had changed too. Competitors in each horizontal bar of competence and competition now fought for the largest share of that bar. The power of this approach to computing is based on mass production and mass distribution. Those that win inevitably get stronger, those that lose, over time, get weaker. After 1981, when IBM chose Intel to provide the microprocessor in their PC, Intel grew to become the most widely accepted supplier of microprocessors. After that, industry participants in the layers above, i.e., computer manufacturers and operating system suppliers, found it more economically advantageous to build their business on Intel architecture microchips than on any other. Why? Because there were a lot more of those being produced every year. If you base your business on the volume leader, you will be going after a larger business yourself. Developers of applications programs were driven toward volume as well. Their alternatives were to develop a product based on Microsoft's market share leading Windows or on competitive operating systems with a smaller market share. Over time, they chose to base their work on the former, gradually reinforcing the success of Intel's microprocessors and Microsoft's operating systems. The transformation of the industry from the old model to the new didn't take place in one instant. It took place over years. It took place in many small steps as mainframe computers lost new applications to PCs, as programmers shifted their attention, as old software companies shrank and new software companies grew. Over time, thousands of such individual events made up the transformation. Let's think about what this transformation from the vertical industry structure to the horizontal must have been like at one of the mainframe computer companies. In particular, let's look at it from IBM's standpoint. IBM had been the strongest player in the old industry. What was the impact of this change on IBM? First of all, IBM's growth slowed down as much of computing went from mainframes to microprocessor-based personal computers. But that's not all. IBM was composed of a group of people who had won time and time again, decade after decade, in the battle among vertical computer players. The managers who ran IBM grew up in this world. They got selected for their excellence in developing products and competing in the marketplace within this framework. Their long reign of success deeply reinforced and ingrained the thought processes and instincts that led to winning in the vertical industry. So when the industry changed, they attempted to use the same type of thinking regarding product development and competitiveness that had worked so well in the past. Even something as simple as the choice of the name OS/2 showed how IBM missed the significance of the horizontal industry. The idea of OS/2, a new personal computer operating system, was introduced in 1987 at the same time as a new line of IBM personal computers called the PS/2. Even though it wasn't necessarily the case, the inference was that OS/2 worked only on PS/2 computers. That perception alone might have been enough to limit the success of OS/2, since the majority of personal computers were made by IBM's competitors, not by IBM itself. But there was, in fact, more to it than just that. It took a long while before IBM actually provided the necessary adaptations to OS/2 to make it work with other manufacturers' computers, and an even longer time before IBM started marketing their operating systems to other computer manufacturers, their competitors, so that those manufacturers could ship OS/2 with their computers as they were accustomed to doing with DOS and Windows. I happened to be a witness as an IBM manager who was involved with both the PS/2 line of personal computers and the OS/2 operating system tried to persuade another large personal computer manufacturer to adopt OS/2 for the latter's PC line. It was the oddest marketing meeting ever. These two people thought of themselves, first and foremost, as PC competitors. Even though his primary mission was to popularize OS/2, the IBM person was emotionally hamstrung in his attempt to market to his competitor. At the same time, the representative of the other computer manufacturer was reluctant to rely on IBM, a PC competitor, for such an important piece of technology as the operating system. The conversation was awkward and tense. The deal never materialized. OS/2 still hasn't gained broad popularity in the industry. Clearly, the old world was no more. Something had changed. And the more successful the players were in the earlier industry, the harder a time they had to change with it. Winners and losers. When an industry goes through a strategic inflection point, the practitioners of the old art may have trouble. On the other hand, the new landscape provides an opportunity for people, some of whom may not even be participants in the industry in question, to join and become part of the action. I have mentioned Compaq as an example of a computer company that skyrocketed by becoming a practitioner of the new horizontal computer industry. Although their original business model consisted of being a follower of IBM as a maker of IBM-compatible personal computers, when the introduction of a new microprocessor in 1985 provided an opportunity to go for a market share leading position, they took the chance and got out in front, ahead of IBM. This initiative propelled them to a growing share of the PC bar, and eventually they even passed IBM as the world's largest maker of IBM-compatible PCs. There were others who, being born into the new order, were unfettered by old concepts or old rules. In the early 80s, Michael Dell started supplying his friends with computers he assembled out of parts in his dorm room at the University of Texas. Basically, he tapped into the desire of customers of the horizontal PC industry for low-cost standard computer systems. Later, Dell built on his experience and started a company based on the premise that people other than his college friends would also be interested in purchasing computers customized to their specific needs and supplied through direct means, in this case, through orders taken over the phone, with computers delivered by parcel post. No member of the old computer industry would have given a chance to a proposition that said that people would buy computers through the mail. It would simply have been seen as an unnatural act. Just as dogs don't fly, people don't buy mail order computers. At least, they didn't in the old world order. Today, Dell Computer Corporation of Austin, Texas, is doing about $5 billion worth of business a year, still true to its original premise, selling personal computers custom assembled to the individual buyer's specifications, through the mail. This could only happen in a world of computers that is characterized by low-cost, mass-produced, mass-consumed items. Few of the top 10 participants in the new horizontal computer industry rose from the ranks of the old vertical computer industry, bearing testimony to the observation that it is truly difficult for a successful industry participant to adapt to a completely different industry structure. Some members of the old industry managed to renew themselves in a manner that was consistent with the new industry structure but would not have been with the old. NCR, in the early 80s, before the transition gathered speed, was one of the bigger vertical computer players. It was among the first, if not the first, to recognize the forces of change. Over the course of a few years, and before they were acquired by AT&T, NCR moved their entire computer line onto commonly available microprocessors. They abandoned their proprietary chips and hardware design, and made major modifications in their software, so that what was originally designed to run on their proprietary architecture would now run on off-the-shelf microprocessors. Unisys, a vertical computer company created from the combination of two independent computer companies, Sperry and Burroughs, was another one of the players in the old computer industry, a multi-billion-dollar company. They hit hard times as the strategic inflection point wreaked havoc on the vertical companies. In adapting, Unisys, once a proud designer of first-class computers, moved their strategic focus to software and services built around the products of the new horizontal computer industry. In effect, they came to the conclusion that they couldn't fight this industry-wide change, so they adapted to it. Sometimes the changes are even more dramatic. In the early 80s, Novell was a small company fashioned along the lines of the old computer industry. They built hardware and developed network software to run on their own hardware. They, too, hit hard times. Novell's then head, Ray Nurda, often tells the story that it wasn't very hard to figure out what to do. They simply didn't have enough money to continue to pay their suppliers, so they abandoned their hardware business and concentrated on software where they didn't need to worry about supplier bills. Then they moved their software onto inexpensive standard PCs. By moving quickly into a new way of doing business, Novell became a first mover in networking in the new horizontal industry and became a billion-dollar software company by the end of the decade. There is an important lesson to be learned from Novell's experience. Whereas as a hardware producer Novell had lack of scale working against them, by being the first to popularize networking software that runs on PCs and capturing a large share of the emerging networking market, they made scale work for them. They turned from losers to winners. In fact, there are two more lessons here. First, when a strategic inflection point sweeps through the industry, the more successful a participant was in the old industry structure, the more threatened it is by change and the more reluctant it is to adapt to it. Second, whereas the cost to enter a given industry in the face of well-entrenched participants can be very high, when the structure breaks, the cost to enter may become trivially small, giving rise to Compaqs, Dells, and Novells, each of which emerged from practically nothing to become major corporations. What's common among these companies is that they all instinctively followed the rules for success in a horizontal industry. The new rules of the horizontal industry. Horizontal industries live and die by mass production and mass marketing. They have their own rules. The companies that have done well in the brutally competitive horizontal computer industry have learned these implicit rules. By following them, a company has the opportunity to compete and prosper. By defying them, no matter how good its products are, no matter how well they execute their plans, a company is slogging uphill. What are these rules? There are three. 1. Don't differentiate without a difference. Don't introduce improvements whose only purpose is to give you an advantage over your competitor without giving your customer a substantial advantage. The personal computer industry is characterized by well-chronicled failures when manufacturers, ostensibly motivated by a desire to make a better PC, departed from the mainstream standard. But goodness in a PC was inseparable from compatibility, so a better PC that was different turned out to be a technological oxymoron. 2. In this hyper-competitive horizontal world, opportunity knocks when a technology break or other fundamental change comes your way. Grab it. The first mover and only the first mover, the company that acts while the others dither, has a true opportunity to gain time over its competitors, and time advantage, in this business, is the surest way to gain market share. Conversely, people who try to fight the wave of a new technology lose in spite of their best efforts because they waste valuable time. 3. Price for what the market will bear, price for volume, then work like the devil on your costs so that you can make money at that price. This will lead you to achieve economies of scale in which the large investments that are necessary can be effective and productive and will make sense because, by being a large volume supplier, you can spread and recoup those costs. By contrast, cost-based pricing will often lead you into a niche position, which in a mass production-based industry is not very lucrative. I think these rules are pretty general for horizontally based industries. I also think that there is a general trend toward horizontally based structure in many parts of industry and commerce. As an industry becomes more competitive, companies are forced to retreat to their strongholds and specialize, in order to become world-class in whatever segment they end up occupying. Why is this so? In our example, a vertical computer company had to produce computer platforms and operating systems and software. A horizontal computer company, however, supplies just one product, for example, computer platforms, or operating systems or software. By virtue of the functional specialization that prevails, horizontal industries tend to be more cost-effective than their vertical equivalents. Simply put, it's harder to be the best of class in several fields than in just one. As industries shift from the vertical to the horizontal model, each participant will have to work its way through a strategic inflection point. Consequently, operating by these rules will be necessary for a larger and larger class of companies as time goes on. They are everywhere. Strategic inflection points are not a phenomenon of the high-tech industry, nor are they something that happens to the other guy. When a Walmart moves into a small town, the environment changes for every retailer in that town. A 10X factor has arrived. When the technology for sound in movies became popular, every silent actor and actress personally experienced the 10X factor of technological change. When container shipping revolutionized sea transportation, a 10X factor reordered the major ports around the world. Reading the daily newspapers through a 10X lens constantly exposes potential strategic inflection points. Does the wave of bank mergers that is sweeping the United States today have anything to do with a 10X change? Does the acquisition of ABC by Disney or Time Warner's proposed merger with Turner Broadcasting System have anything to do with one? Does the self-imposed breakup of AT&T? In subsequent chapters, I will discuss common reactions and behavior that occur when strategic inflection points arise, as well as approaches and techniques for dealing with them. My purpose in this chapter is to sweep through a variety of examples of strategic inflection points drawn from different industries. By learning from the painful experience of others, we can improve our ability to recognize a strategic inflection point that's about to affect us. And that's half the battle. I'll largely use the framework of Porter's competitive analysis model, as most strategic inflection points originate with a large 10X change in one of the forces affecting the business. I will describe examples that are triggered by a 10X change in the force of the competition, a 10X change in the technology, a 10X change in the power of customers, a 10X change in the power of suppliers and complementors, and a 10X change that is due to the imposition or the removal of regulations. The pervasiveness of the 10x factor raises the question, is every strategic inflection point characterized by a 10x change? And does every 10x change lead to a strategic inflection point? I think for all practical purposes the answer to both of these questions is yes. 10x change, competition. There's competition and there's mega competition, and when there's mega competition a 10x force the business landscape changes. Sometimes the nature of the mega competition is obvious, and the story of Walmart that follows will give an example of that. Sometimes the mega competition sneaks up on you. It doesn't do business the way you are used to having business done, but it will lure your customers away just the same. The story of next will give an example of that. Walmart, an overwhelming force in town. From the standpoint of a general store in a small town, a Walmart store is competition. So were the other general stores that it previously had to compete with. But Walmart comes to town with a superior just-in-time logistics system, with inventory management based on modern scanners and satellite communications, with trucks that go from store to hub to store continuously replenishing inventories, with large volume-based purchase costs, systematic company-wide training programs, and a finely tuned store location system designed to pinpoint areas where competition is generally weak. All this adds up to a 10x factor compared to the other competition the store previously had to face. For a small town general store, once Walmart moves to town, things will have changed in a big way. A far superior competitor appearing on the scene is a mandate for you to change. Continuing to do what worked before doesn't work anymore. What would work against a Walmart? Specialization has a good chance. In-depth stocking, serving a particular market segment, as Home Depot, Office Depot, Toys R Us and similar category killers are doing, can work to offset the overall imbalance of scale. So can customized service, as Staples is implementing through an in-depth computerized customer database. Alternatively, so might redefining your business to provide an environment, rather than a product, that people value, like the example of an independent bookstore that became a coffee house with books to compete with the chain bookstores that brought Walmart-style competitive advantages to their business. Next, the software company. When Steve Jobs co-founded Apple, he created an immensely successful, fully vertical personal computer company. Apple made their own hardware, designed their own operating system software, and created their own graphical user interface, what the customer sees on the computer screen when he or she starts working with the computer. They even attempted to develop their own applications. When Jobs left Apple in 1985, he set out, for all intents and purposes, to recreate the same success story. He just wanted to do it better. As even the name of his new company implied, he wanted to create the next generation of superbly engineered hardware, a graphical user interface that was even better than Apple's Macintosh interface and an operating system that was capable of more advanced tasks than the Mac. The software would be built in such a way that customers could tailor applications to their own uses by rearranging chunks of existing software rather than having to write it from the ground up. Jobs wanted to tie all of this, the hardware, the basic software and the graphical user interface together to create a computer system that would be in a class by itself. It took a few years, but he did something close to that. The next computer and operating system delivered on basically all of these objectives. Yet while Jobs was focusing on an ambitious and complex development task, he ignored a key development that was to render most of his efforts futile. While he and his employees were spending days and nights developing the superb sleek computer, a mass-produced, broadly available graphical user interface, Microsoft Windows, had come on the market. Windows wasn't even as good as the Mac, let alone the next interface, and it wasn't seamlessly integrated with computers or applications. But it was cheap, it worked and, most importantly, it worked on the inexpensive and increasingly powerful personal computers that by the late 80s were available from hundreds of PC manufacturers. While Jobs was burning the midnight oil inside Next, in the outside world something changed. When Jobs started developing Next, the competition he had in mind was the Mac. PCs were not even a blip on his competitive radar screen. After all, at that time PCs didn't even have an easy-to-use graphical interface. But by the time the next computer system emerged 3 years later, Microsoft's persistent efforts with Windows were about to change the PC environment. The world of Windows would share some of the characteristics of the Mac world in that it provided a graphical user interface, but it also retained the fundamental characteristics of the PC world, i.e., Windows worked on computers that were available anywhere in the world from hundreds of sources. As a result of fierce competition by the hundreds of computer manufacturers supplying them, these computers became far more affordable than the Mac. It was as if Steve Jobs and his company had gone into a time capsule when they started Next. They worked hard for years, competing against what they thought was the competition, but by the time they emerged, the competition turned out to be something completely different and much more powerful. Although they were oblivious to it, Next found itself in the midst of a strategic inflection point. The Next machine never took off. In fact, despite ongoing infusions of investors' cash, Next was hemorrhaging money. They were trying to maintain an expensive computer development operation, in addition to a state-of-the-art software development operation, plus a fully automated factory built to produce a large volume of Next computers, a large volume that never materialized. By 1991, about 6 years after its founding, Next was in financial difficulties. Some managers inside the company had advocated throwing in the towel in hardware and porting their crown jewel to mass-produced PCs. Jobs resisted this for a long time. He didn't like PCs. He thought they were inelegant and poorly engineered, and the many players in the industry made any kind of uniformity hard to achieve. In short, Jobs thought PCs were a mess. The thing is, he was right. But what Jobs missed at the time was that the very messiness of the PC industry that he despised was the result of its power, many companies competing to offer better value to ever larger numbers of customers. Some of his managers got frustrated and quit, yet their idea continued to ferment. As Next's funds grew lower and lower, Jobs finally accepted the inevitability of the inelegant, messy PC industry as his environment. He threw his weight behind the proposal he had fought. He shut down all hardware development and the spanking new automated factory, and laid off half of his staff. Bowing to the 10X force of the PC industry, Next, the software company, was born. Steve Jobs is arguably the founding genius of the personal computer industry, the person who at age 20 saw what in the next decade would become a $100 billion worldwide industry. Yet 10 years later, at 30, Jobs was stuck in his own past. In his past, insanely great computers, a favorite phrase of his, won in the market. Graphical interfaces were powerful differentiators because PC software was clunky. As things changed, although many of his managers knew better, Jobs did not easily give up the conviction that had made him such a passionate and effective pioneer. It took facing a business survival situation for reality to win over long-held dogmas. 10X change, technology. Technology changes all the time. Typewriters get better, cars get better, computers get better. Most of this change is gradual. Competitors deliver the next improvement, we respond, they respond in turn, and so it goes. However, every once in a while, technology changes in a dramatic way. Something can be done that could not be done before, or something can be done 10X better, faster, or cheaper than it would have been done before. We'll look at a few examples that are clear because they are in the past. But even as I write this, technological developments are brewing that are likely to bring changes of the same magnitude or bigger in the years ahead. Will digital entertainment replace movies as we know them? Will digital information replace newspapers and magazines? Will remote banking render conventional banks relics of the past? Will the wider availability of interconnected computers bring wholesale changes to the practice of medicine? To be sure, not all technological possibilities have a major impact. Electric cars haven't, nor has commercial nuclear power generation. but some have and others will. Sound takes over silent movies. Something changed when the jazz singer debuted on October 6, 1927. Movies didn't used to have sound, now they did. With that single qualitative change, the lives of many stars and many directors of the silent movies were affected in a profound way. Some made the change, while some tried to adapt and failed. Others still clung to their old trade, simply adopting an attitude of denial in the face of a major environmental change and rationalizing their actions by questioning why anyone would want talking movies. As late as 1931, Charlie Chaplin was still fighting the move to sound. In an interview that year, he proclaimed, "I give the talkies 6 months more." Chaplin's powerful audience appeal and craftsmanship were such that he was able to make successful silent movies throughout the 1930s. However, even Charlie Chaplin couldn't hold out forever. Chaplin finally surrendered to spoken dialogue with the great dictator in 1940. Others adjusted with great agility. Greta Garbo was a superstar of silent movies. With the advent of sound, in 1930 her studio introduced her to speaking roles in Anna Christie. Billboards proclaiming "Garbo Speaks" advertised the movie across the country. The movie was both a critical and a commercial success, and Garbo went on to establish herself as a star of silent films who made a successful transition to talkies. What company would not be envious of getting through a strategic inflection point with such alacrity? Yet is this industry going to be equally successful in navigating another strategic inflection point that's caused by the advent of digital technology, by which actors can be replaced by lifelike looking, live-sounding digital creations? Pixar's movie Toy Story is an example of what could be done in this fashion. It's the first feature-length result of a new technology. What will this technology be able to do 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I suspect this technology will bring with it another strategic inflection point. It never ends. Upheaval in the shipping industry. Technology transformed the worldwide shipping industry as dramatically and decisively as sound transformed the movie industry. In the span of a decade, a virtual instant in the history of shipping, the standardization of shipbuilding designs, the creation of refrigerated transport ships and, most importantly, the evolution of containerization, a technology that permitted the easy transfer of cargo on and off ships, introduced a 10x change in the productivity of shipping, reversing an inexorably rising trend in costs. The situation was ripe for a technological breakthrough in the way ports handled cargo, and it came. As with the movie industry, some ports made the change, others tried but couldn't, and many resolutely fought this trend. Consequently, the new technologies led to a worldwide reordering of shipping ports. As of the time of this writing, Singapore, its skyline filled with the silhouettes of modern port equipment, has emerged as a major shipping center in Southeast Asia, and Seattle has become one of the foremost ports for containerized cargo ships on the West Coast. Without the room to accommodate modern equipment, New York City, once a major magnet for shipping, has been steadily losing money. Ports that didn't adopt the new technologies have become candidates for redevelopment into shopping malls, recreation areas, and waterfront apartment complexes. After each strategic inflection point, there are winners and there are losers. Whether a port won or lost clearly depended on how it responded to the 10x force in technology that engulfed it. The PC revolution, a tale of denial. A fundamental rule in technology says that whatever can be done will be done. Consequently, once the PC brought a 10x lower cost for a given performance, it was only a matter of time before its impact would spread through the entire computing world and transform it. This change didn't happen from one day to the next. It came gradually, as the graph below indicates, with price/performance trends. Computer economics, cost per MIPS. A measure of computing power, based on fully configured system prices for current year. There were people in the industry who could surmise the appearance of this trend and who concluded that the price/performance characteristics of microprocessor-based PCs would win out in time. Some companies, NCR and Hewlett-Packard come to mind, modified their strategies to take advantage of the power of microprocessors. Other companies were in denial, much as Chaplin was with talkies. Denial took different forms. In 1984, the then head of Digital Equipment Corporation, the largest mini-computer maker at the time, sounding a lot like Chaplin, described PCs as cheap, short-lived and not very accurate machines. This attitude was especially ironic when you consider Digital's past. Digital broke into the world of computers, then dominated by mainframes, in the 1960s with simply designed and inexpensive mini-computers, and grew to become a very large company with that strategy. Yet when they were faced with a new technological change in their environment, Digital, once the revolutionary that attacked the mainframe world, now resisted this change along with the incumbents of the mainframe era. In another example of denial, IBM's management steadfastly blamed weakness in the worldwide economy as the cause of trouble at IBM in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and continued to do that year after year as PCs progressively transformed the face of computing. Why would computer executives who had proven themselves to be brilliant and entrepreneurial managers throughout their careers have such a hard time facing the reality of a technologically driven strategic inflection point? Was it because they were sheltered from news from the periphery? Or was it because they had such enormous confidence that the skills that had helped them succeed in the past would help them succeed in the face of whatever the new technology should bring? Or was it because the objectively calculable consequence of facing up to the new world of computing, like the monumental cutbacks in staff that would be necessary, were so painful as to be inconceivable? It's hard to know, but the reaction is all too common. I think all these factors played a part, but the last one, the resistance to facing a painful new world, was the most important. Perhaps the best analogy to Charlie Chaplin's late conversion to the new medium is recent reports that Steve Chen, the former key designer of the immensely successful Cray supercomputers, started a company of his own based on high-performance, industry-standard microprocessor chips. Chen's previous company, which attempted to create the world's fastest supercomputer, was one of the last holdouts of the old computing paradigm. But as Chen described his switch to a technological approach he once eschewed, he did so with a slight understatement: "I took a different approach this time." 10x change, customers. Customers drifting away from their former buying habits may provide the most subtle and insidious cause of a strategic inflection point. Subtle and insidious because it takes place slowly. In an analysis of the history of business failures, Harvard Business School professor Richard Tidlow came to the conclusion that businesses fail either because they leave their customers, i.e., they arbitrarily change a strategy that worked for them in the past, the obvious change, or because their customers leave them, the subtle one. Think about it. Right now, a whole generation of young people in the United States has been brought up to take computers for granted. Pointing with a mouse is no more mysterious to them than hitting the on button on the television is to their parents. They feel utterly comfortable with using computers and are no more affected by their computer crashing than their parents are when their car stalls on a cold morning. They just shrug, mumble something and start up again. When they go to college, these young people get their homework assignments on the college's networked computers, do their research on the internet and arrange their weekend activities by email. Consumer companies that are counting on these young people as future customers need to be concerned with the pervasive change in how they get and generate information, transact their business and live their lives, or else those companies may lose their customers' attention. Doesn't this represent a demographic time bomb that is ticking away? Changing tastes in cars. None of this is new. During the 1920s, the market for automobiles changed slowly and subtly. Henry Ford's slogan for the Model T, "It takes you there and brings you back," epitomized the original attraction of the car as a mode of basic transportation. In 1921, more than half of all cars sold in the United States were Fords. But in a post-World War I world in which style and leisure had become important considerations in people's lives, Alfred Sloan at General Motors saw a market for a car for every purse and purpose. Thanks to GM's introduction of a varied product line and annual model changes, By the end of the decade, General Motors had taken the lead in both profits and market share, and would continue to outperform Ford in profit for more than 60 years. General Motors saw the market changing and went with the change. Attitude shifts. Sometimes a change in the customer base represents a subtle change of attitude, yet one so inexorable that it can have a 10x force. In hindsight, the consumer reaction to the Pentium processor's floating point flaw in 1994 represented such a change. The center of gravity of Intel's customer base shifted over time from the computer manufacturers to the computer users. The Intel Inside program, begun in 1991, established a mindset in computer users that they were, in fact, Intel's customers, even though they didn't actually buy anything from us. It was an attitude change, a change we actually stimulated, but one whose impact we at Intel did not fully comprehend. Is the Pentium processor floating point incident a standalone incident, a bump in the road, or, to use electronic parlance, noise? Or is it a signal, a fundamental change in whom we sell to and whom we service? I think it is the latter. The computer industry has largely become one that services consumers who use their own discretionary spending to purchase a product, and who apply the same expectations to those products that they have for other household goods. Intel has had to start adjusting to this new reality, and so have other players in this industry. The environment has changed for all of us. The good news is, we all have a much larger market. The bad news is, it is a much tougher market than we were accustomed to servicing. The point is, what is a demographic time bomb for consumer companies represents good news for us in the computer business. Millions of young people grow up computer savvy, taking our products for granted as a part of their lives. But, and there is always a but, they're going to be a lot more demanding of a product, a lot more discerning of weaknesses in it. Are all of us in this industry getting ready for this subtle shift? I'm not so sure. The double whammy in supercomputers. Sometimes more than one of the 6 competitive forces changes in a big way. The combination of factors results in a strategic inflection point that can be even more dramatic than a strategic inflection point caused by just one force. The supercomputer industry, the part of the computer industry that supplies the most powerful of all computers, provides a good case in point. Supercomputers are used to study everything from nuclear energy to weather patterns. The industry's approach was similar to the old vertical computer industry. Its customer base was heavily dependent on government spending, defense projects, and other types of big research. Both changed in approximately the same time frame. Technology moved to a microprocessor base and government spending dried up when the Cold War ended, increasing pressure on defense spending reduction. The result is that a $1 billion industry that had been the pride and joy of U.S. technology and a mainstay of the defense posture of this country is suddenly in trouble. Nothing signifies this more than the fact that Cray Computer Corporation, a company founded by the icon of the supercomputer age, Seymour Cray, was unable to maintain operations due to lack of funds. It's yet another example illustrating that the person who is the star of a previous era is often the last one to adapt to change, the last one to yield to the logic of a strategic inflection point, and tends to fall harder than most. 10x change, suppliers. Businesses often take their suppliers for granted. They are there to serve us, and, if we don't like what they do, we tend to think we can always replace them with someone who better fills our needs. But sometimes, whether because of a change in technology or a change in industry structure, suppliers can become very powerful, so powerful, in fact, that they can affect the way the rest of the industry does business. Airlines flex their muscles. Recently, the supplier base in the travel industry has attempted to flex its muscles. Here, the principal supplier is the airlines, which used to grant travel agents a 10% commission on every ticket sold. Even though travel agent commissions were the airline industry's third largest cost, after labor and fuel, airlines had avoided changing the commission rates because travel agents sell about 85% of all tickets and they did not want to antagonize them. However, rising prices and industry cutbacks finally forced the airlines to place a cap on commissions. Can travel agencies continue as before in the face of a significant loss of income? Within days of the airline's decision, two of the country's largest agencies instituted a policy of charging customers for low-cost purchases. Will such a charge stick? What should the travel agencies do if the caps on commissions remain a fact of life and if their customers won't absorb any of their changes? One industry association predicted that 40% of all agencies might go out of business. It is possible that this single act by the suppliers can precipitate a strategic inflection point that might in time alter the entire travel industry. The end of second sourcing. Intel, in its capacity as a supplier of microprocessors, accelerated the morphing of the computer industry when we changed our practice of second sourcing. Second sourcing, once common in our industry, refers to a practice in which a supplier, in order to make sure that his product is widely accepted, turns to his competitors and offers them technical know-how, so that they, too, can supply this product. In theory, this unnatural competitive act works out as a win for all parties. The developer of the product benefits by a wider customer acceptance of the product as a result of a broader supplier base. The second source supplier, who is a recipient of the technology, clearly benefits by getting valuable technology while giving little in return. And the customer for the product in question benefits by having a larger number of suppliers who will compete for his business. In practice, however, things don't often work out that well. When the product needs help in the marketplace, the second source usually is not yet producing, so the primary source and the customers don't have the benefit of the extended supply. Once the product is fully in production and supply catches up with demand, the second source is in production too, so multiple companies now compete for the same business. This may please the customer but certainly hurts the wallet of the prime source. And so it goes. By the mid-80s, we found that the disadvantages of this practice outweighed its advantages for us. So we changed. Our resolve hardened by tough business conditions. More about this in the next chapter. We decided to demand tangible compensation for our technology. Our competitors were reluctant to pay for technology that we used to give away practically for free. Consequently, in the transition to the next microprocessor generation, we ended up with no second source and became the only source of microprocessors to our customers. Eventually our competition stopped waiting for our largest and developed similar products on their own, but this took a number of years. The impact this relatively minor change had on the entire PC industry was enormous. A key commodity, the standard microprocessor on which most personal computers were built, became available only from its developer us. This, in turn, had two consequences. First, our influence on our customers increased. From their standpoint, this might have appeared as a 10x force. Second, since most PCs increasingly were built on microprocessors from one supplier, they became more alike. This, in turn, had an impact on software developers, who could now concentrate their efforts on developing software for fundamentally similar computers built by many manufacturers. The result of the morphing of the computer industry, i.e., the emergence of computers as a practically interchangeable commodity, has been greatly aided by the common microprocessor on which they were built. 10x change, complementers. Changes in technology affecting the business of your complementers, companies whose products you depend on, can also have a profound effect on your business. The personal computer industry and Intel have had a mutual dependence on personal computing software companies. Should major technological changes affect the software business, through the complementary relationship these changes might affect our business as well. For example, there is a school of thought that suggests that software generated for the Internet will grow in importance and eventually prevail in personal computing. If this were to happen, it would indirectly affect our business too. I'll examine this in more depth in Chapter 9. 10x change, regulation. Until now, We have followed the possible changes that can take place when one of the 6 forces affecting the competitive well-being of a business changes by a 10x factor. That diagram illustrates the workings of a free market unregulated by any external agency or government. But in real business life, such regulations, their appearance or disappearance, can bring about changes just as profound as any that we have discussed. The demise of patent medicines. The history of the American drug industry provides a dramatic example of how the environment can change with the onset of regulation. At the start of the 20th century, patent medicines made up of alcohol and narcotics were peddled freely without any labels to warn consumers of the dangerous and addictive nature of their contents. The uncontrolled proliferation of patent medicines finally triggered the government into the business of regulating what was put into the bottles, and led to the passage of a law requiring manufacturers of all medicines to label the ingredients of their elixirs. In 1906, the Food and Drugs Act was passed by Congress. The drug industry changed overnight. The introduction of the labeling requirement exposed the fact that patent medicines were spiked with everything from alcohol to morphine to cannabis to cocaine, and forced their manufacturers to reformulate their products or take them off the shelves. The competitive landscape changed in the wake of the passage of the Food and Drugs Act. Now a company that wanted to be in the drug business needed to develop knowledge and skills that were substantially different from before. Some companies navigated through this strategic inflection point, many others disappeared. The reordering of telecommunications. Regulatory changes have been instrumental in changing the nature of other very large industries. Consider the American telecommunications industry. Prior to 1968, the U.S. telecommunications industry was practically a nationwide monopoly. AT&T, the telephone company, designed and manufactured its own equipment, ranging from telephone handsets to switching systems, and provided all connections between phone calls, both local and long distance. Then, in 1968, the Federal Communications Commission ruled that the phone company could not require the use of its own equipment at the customer's location. This decision changed the landscape for telephone handsets and switching systems. It opened the business up to foreign equipment manufacturers, including the major Japanese telecommunications companies. The business that had been the domain of the slow-moving, well-oiled monopoly of the benign Ma Bell became rife with competition from the likes of Northern Telecom of Canada, NEC, and Fujitsu from Japan, and Silicon Valley startups like Realm. Telephone handsets, which the customer used to receive as part of the service from the old AT&T, now became commodities to be purchased at the corner electronics store. They were largely made at low labor cost in countries in Asia, and they came in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and functions, competing aggressively in price. And the familiar ringing of the telephone was supplanted by a cacophony of buzzes. But all this was only a prelude to even bigger events. In the early 1970s, the U.S. government, following a private antitrust suit by AT&T competitor MCI, brought suit, demanding the breakup of the Bell system and asking for the separation of long-distance services from local access services. The story goes that after years of wrangling in the federal courts, a struggle which promised to go on for many more years, Charles Brown, then chairman of AT&T, one morning called his staff one at a time and told them that instead of putting the company through many years of litigation with an uncertain outcome, he would voluntarily go along with the breakup of the company. By 1984, this decision became the basis for what is known as the Modified Final Judgment, supervised by federal Judge Harold Green, that prescribed the way long-distance companies were to conduct business with the 7 regional telephone companies. The telephone service monopoly crumbled, practically overnight. I called on AT&T locations in those days to sell Intel microprocessors to their switching systems divisions. I still remember the profound state of bewilderment of AT&T managers. They had been in the same business for most of their professional lives and simply had no clue as to how things would go now that the customary financial, personal and social rules by which they had conducted themselves, division to division, manager to manager, were broken. The impact of those events on the entire communications industry was equally dramatic. A competitive long-distance industry was created. Over the subsequent decade, AT&T lost 40% of the long-distance market to a number of competitors, some of whom, like MCI and Sprint, became multi-billion-dollar companies themselves. A new set of independent companies operating regional telephone systems, often called the Baby Bells, were created. Each of these, with revenues in the $10 billion range, was left the task of connecting individuals and companies in their area to each other and to a competitive long-distance network. The modified final judgment let them operate as monopolies in their own areas, subject to a variety of restrictions in terms of the businesses they might or might not participate in. The Baby Bells themselves now face a similar upheaval, as changes in technology prompt further regulatory moves. The evolution of cellular telephony and a cable network that reaches 60% of U.S. houses provides alternative ways of connecting to the individual customers. Even as I write this, Congress labors to catch up with the impact of these changes in technology. No matter which way the Telecommunications Act will be rewritten, no matter how much the Charlie Chaplins and Seymour Crays of telephony fight the changes, they are coming. On the other side of this inflection point there will be a far more competitive business landscape for all aspects of the telecommunications business. Of course, in retrospect it is easy to see that the creation of pharmaceutical regulations 90 years ago and the events that shaped the current telecommunications industry a decade ago clearly represented strategic inflection points for those industries. It is harder to decide whether the cross-currents you are experiencing right now represent one. Privatization. Much of the world is embroiled in what I want to call the mother of all regulatory changes, privatization. Companies that have had a long history of operating as state-owned monopolies, from China to the former Soviet Union to the United Kingdom, at the stroke of a pen are being placed in a competitive environment. They have no experience of how to deal with competition. They never had to market to consumers. After all, why would a monopoly have to court customers? AT&T, for example, had no experience dealing with competition, so they never had to market their products or services. They had all the customers that there were. Their management grew up in a regulatory environment where their core competencies revolved around their ability to work with the regulators. Their workforce was accustomed to a paternalistic work environment. In the 10 years of the free-for-all that followed the modified final judgment, AT&T lost 40% of the long-distance market. However, they also mastered consumer marketing skills. Now AT&T advertises on television for new customers, makes a point of thanking you for using AT&T every time you connect with them, and has even developed a distinctive sound to signal their presence, a sort of warm and fuzzy bong. All examples of world-class consumer marketing by a company where marketing used to be seen as a foreign art. Deutsche Bundespost Telekom, Germany's state-owned telecommunications company, is slated to be liberalized by the end of 1997. To steer the renamed Deutsche Telekom through the troubled waters, the company's supervisory board recently appointed a 45-year-old consumer marketing manager from Sony to be its next CEO. This action suggests that the board understands that the future will be very, very different from the past. When most companies of a previously regulated economy are suddenly thrust into a competitive environment, the changes multiply. Management now has to excel at marketing their services in the midst of a global cacophony of competing products, and every person on the labor force suddenly must compete for his or her job with employees of similar companies on the other side of the globe. This is the greatest strategic inflection point of all. When such fundamental changes hit a whole economy simultaneously, their impact is cataclysmic. They affect an entire country's political system, its social norms and its way of life. This is what we see in the former Soviet Union and, in a more controlled fashion, in China. In this chapter I have tried to show that strategic inflection points are common, that they are not just a contemporary phenomenon, that they are not limited to the high-tech industry, nor are they something that only happens to the other guy. They are all different yet all share similar characteristics. The table provides a snapshot of what the examples in this chapter illustrate. As I scan it, I can't help but be impressed by the variety and pervasiveness of strategic inflection points. Note that everywhere there are winners and losers. And note also that, to a large extent, whether a company became a winner or a loser was related to its degree of adaptability. Strategic inflection points offer promises as well as threats. It is at such times of fundamental change that the cliché adapt or die takes on its true meaning. Strategic inflection points, changes and results. Why not do it ourselves? The memory business crisis and how we dealt with it is how I learned the meaning of a strategic inflection point. Managing, especially managing through a crisis, is an extremely personal affair. Many years ago, in a management class I attended, the instructor played a scene from the World War II movie 12 O'Clock High. In this movie, a new commander is called in to straighten out an unruly squadron of flyers who had become undisciplined to the point of self-destruction. On his way to take charge, the new commander stops his car, steps out and smokes a cigarette, while gazing off into the distance. Then he draws one last puff, throws the cigarette down, grinds it out with his heel and turns to his driver and says, "Okay, Sergeant, let's go." Our instructor played the scene over and over to illustrate a superbly enacted instance of building up the determination necessary to undertake the hard, unpleasant and treacherous task of leading a group of people through an excruciatingly tough set of changes the moment when a leader decides to go forward, no matter what. I always related to the scene and empathized with that officer. Little did I know when I watched that movie that I would have to go through something similar in a few years' time. But beyond experiencing this crisis personally, the incident that I'm about to describe is how I learned with every fiber of my being what a strategic inflection point is about and what it takes to claw your way through one, inch by excruciating inch. It takes objectivity, the willingness to act on your convictions and the passion to mobilize people into supporting those convictions. This sounds like a tall order, and it is. The story I'm going to tell you is about how Intel got out of the business it was founded on and how it refocused its efforts on and built a new identity in a totally different business, all in the midst of a crisis of mammoth proportions. I learned an enormous amount about managing through strategic inflection points as a result of this experience, and throughout the rest of this book, I will refer back to these events to illustrate what I learned. I'm afraid I have to drag you through some details. Bear with me. While the story is unique to Intel, the lessons, I believe, are universal. Some history. Intel started in 1968. Every startup has some kind of a core idea. Ours was simple. Semiconductor technology had grown capable of being able to put an ever larger number of transistors on a single silicon chip. We saw this as having some promising implications. An increasing transistor count readily translates into two enormous benefits for the customer: lower cost and higher performance. At the risk of some oversimplification, these come about as follows. Roughly speaking, it costs the same to produce a silicon chip with a larger number of transistors as a chip with a smaller number of transistors, so if we put more transistors on a chip, the cost per transistor would be lower. Not only that, smaller transistors are in closer proximity to each other and therefore handle electronic signals faster, which translates into higher performance in whatever finished gadget, calculator, VCR or computer our chip should be placed into. When we pondered the question of what we could do with this growing number of transistors, the answer seemed obvious: build chips that would perform the function of memory in computers. In other words, put more and more transistors on a chip and use them to increase the capacity of the computer's memory. This approach would inevitably be more cost-effective than any other method, we reasoned, and the world would be ours. We started modestly. Our first product was a 64-bit memory. No, this is not a typo. It could store 64-digit numbers. Today people are working on chips that can store 64 million digits, but this is today and that was then. It turns out that, around the time Intel started, one of the then major computer companies had called for proposals to build exactly such a device. 6 companies, all established in the business, had already bid on the project. We muscled our way in as the 7th bidder. We worked day and night to design the chip and, in parallel, develop the manufacturing process. We worked as if our life depended on it, as in a way it did. From that project emerged the first functional 64-bit memory. As the first to produce a working chip, we won the race. This was a big win for a startup. Next we poured our efforts into developing another chip, a 256-bit memory. Again, we worked day and night, and this was an even harder job. Thanks to a great deal of effort, we introduced our second product a short while after the first. These products were marvels of 1969 technology, and it seemed that every engineer in every organization of every computer maker as well as every semiconductor maker bought one of each to marvel over. Very few people, however, bought production volumes of either. Semiconductor memories were not much more than curiosity items at that time. So we continued to burn cash and went on to develop the next chip. In the tradition of the industry, this chip would contain more transistors than the previous chip. We aimed at a memory chip that was 4 times more complex, containing 1024 digits. This required taking some big technological gambles. But we plugged on, memory engineers, technologists, test engineers and others, a hard-working, if not always harmonious, team. As a result of the pressure we felt, we often spent as much time bickering with one another as working on the problems. But work went on. And this time we hit the jackpot. This device became a big hit. Our new challenge became how to satisfy demand for it. To put this in perspective, we were a company composed of a handful of people with a new type of design and a fragile technology, housed in a little rented building, and we were trying to supply the seemingly insatiable appetite of large computer companies for memory chips. The incredibly tough task of development segued into the nightmare of producing a device that was held together with the silicon equivalent of baling wire and chewing gum. The name of this device was the 1103. To this day, when a digital watch shows that number, I and other survivors of that era still take note. Through our struggle with the first 2 technological curiosities that didn't sell and with the third one that sold but that we had such a hard time producing, Intel became a business and memory chips became an industry. As I think back, it's clear to me that struggling with this tough technology and the accompanying manufacturing problems left an indelible imprint on Intel's psyche. We became good at solving problems. We became highly focused on tangible results, our word for it is output. And from all the early bickering, we developed a style of ferociously arguing with one another while remaining friends. We call this constructive confrontation. As the first mover, we had practically 100% share of the memory chip market segment. Then, in the early 70s, other companies entered and they won some business. They were small American companies, similar to us in size and makeup. They had names like Unisom, Advanced Memory Systems and MOSTEC. If you don't recognize the names, it's because these companies are long gone. By the end of the 70s there were maybe a dozen players in the business, each of us competing to beat the others with the latest technological innovations. With each succeeding generation of memory chips, somebody, not necessarily the same company, got it right, and it certainly wasn't always us. A prominent financial analyst of the day used to report his observations of the memory business using boxing match analogies: round 2 goes to Intel, round 3 goes to MOSTEC, round 4 to Texas Instruments, we're gearing up to fight round 5, and so on. We won our share. Even 10 years into this business, we were one of the key participants. Intel still stood for memories. Conversely, memories meant, usually, Intel. Entering our strategic inflection point. Then, in the early 80s, the Japanese memory producers appeared on the scene. Actually, they had first shown up in the late 70s to fill the product shortages we had created when during a recession we pulled back our investments in production capacity. The Japanese were helpful then. They took the pressure off us. But in the early 80s they appeared in force, in overwhelming force. Things started to feel different now. People who came back from visits to Japan told scary stories. At one big Japanese company, for instance, it was said that memory development activities occupied a whole huge building. Each floor housed designers working on a different memory generation, all at the same time. On one floor were the 16K people, where K stands for 1024 bits, on the floor above were the 64K people, and on the floor above that people were working on 256K bit memories. There were even rumors that in secret projects people were working on a 1,000,000-bit memory. All this was very scary from the point of view of what we still thought of as a little company in Santa Clara, California. Then we were hit by the quality issue. Managers from Hewlett-Packard reported that quality levels of Japanese memories were consistently and substantially better than those produced by the American companies. In fact, the quality levels attributed to Japanese memories were beyond what we thought were possible. Our first reaction was denial. This had to be wrong. As people often do in this kind of situation, we vigorously attacked the ominous data. Only when we confirmed for ourselves that the claims were roughly right did we start to go to work on the quality of our product. But we were clearly behind. As if this weren't enough, the Japanese companies had capital advantages. They had, or were said to have, limitless access to funds from the government. From the parent company through cross-subsidies, or through the mysterious workings of the Japanese capital markets that provided nearly infinite low-cost capital to export-oriented producers. We didn't know exactly how it all worked, but the facts were incontrovertible. As the 80s went on, the Japanese producers were building large and modern factories, amassing a capacity base that was awesome from our perspective. Riding the memory wave, the Japanese producers were taking over the world semiconductor market in front of our eyes. This penetration into the world markets didn't happen overnight, as shown in the figure below. It took place over a decade. Worldwide semiconductor market share. We fought hard. We improved our quality and brought costs down, but the Japanese producers fought back. Their principal weapon was the availability of high-quality product priced astonishingly low. In one instance, we got hold of a memo sent to the sales force of a large Japanese company. The key portion of the memo said, "Win with the 10% rule. Find AMD, another American company, and Intel sockets. Quote 10% below their price. If they requote, go 10% again. Don't quit till you win." This kind of thing was clearly discouraging, but we fought on. We tried a lot of things. We tried to focus on a niche of the memory market segment. We tried to invent special purpose memories called value-added designs. We introduced more advanced technologies and built memories with them. What we were desperately trying to do was to earn a premium for our product in the marketplace, as we couldn't match the Japanese downward pricing spiral. There was a saying at Intel at that time, if we do well we may get 2x, twice the price of Japanese memories, but what good does it do if X gets smaller and smaller? Most importantly, we continued to spend heavily on R&D. After all, we were a company based on technology, and we thought that every problem should have a technological solution. Our R&D was spread among 3 different technologies. Most of it was spent on memory chips. But at the same time a smaller team worked on technology for another device we had invented in 1970 or so, microprocessors. Microprocessors are the brains of the computer. They calculate while memory chips merely store. Microprocessors and memories are built with a similar silicon chip technology, but microprocessors are designed differently than memories. And because they represented a slower growing, smaller volume market than memory chips, we didn't stress their technological development as heavily. The bulk of the memory chip development took place in a spanking new facility in Oregon. The microprocessor technology developers had to share a production facility, not even a new one at that, with the manufacturing folks at a remote site. Our priorities were formed by our identity. After all, memories were us. While the situation on the memory front was tough, life was still good. In 1981, our then leading microprocessor was designed into the original IBM PC, and demand for it exploded far ahead of IBM's expectation. IBM, in turn, looked to us to help them ramp up production of the IBM PC. So did all of IBM's PC competitors. In 1983 and the early part of 1984 we had a heated up market. Everything we made was in short supply. People were pleading with us for more parts and we were booking orders further and further out in time to guarantee a supply. We were scrambling to build more capacity, starting factory construction at different locations and hiring people to ramp up our production volumes. Then in the fall of 1984 all of that changed. Business slowed down. It seemed that nobody wanted to buy chips anymore. Our order backlog evaporated like spring snow. After a period of disbelief, we started cutting back production. But after the long period of build-up, we couldn't wind down fast enough to match the market slide. We were still building inventory even as our business headed south. We had been losing money on memories for quite some time while trying to compete with the Japanese producers' high-quality, low-priced, mass-produced parts. But because business had been so good, we just kept at it, looking for the magical answer that would give us a premium price. We persevered because we could afford to. However, once business slowed down across the board and our other products couldn't take up the slack, the losses really started to hurt. The need for a different memory strategy, one that would stop the hemorrhage, was growing urgent. We had meetings and more meetings, bickering and arguments, resulting in nothing but conflicting proposals. There were those who proposed what they called a go-for-it strategy: let's build a gigantic factory dedicated to producing memories and nothing but memories, and let's take on the Japanese. Others proposed that we should get really clever and use an avant-garde technology, go for it but in a technological rather than a manufacturing sense, and build something the Japanese producers couldn't build. Others were still clinging to the idea that we could come up with special-purpose memories, an increasingly unlikely possibility as memories became a uniform worldwide commodity. Meanwhile, as the debates raged, we just went on losing more and more money. It was a grim and frustrating year. During that time we worked hard without a clear notion of how things were ever going to get better. We had lost our bearings. We were wandering in the valley of death. I remember a time in the middle of 1985, after this aimless wandering had been going on for almost a year. I was in my office with Intel's chairman and CEO, Gordon Moore, and we were discussing our quandary. Our mood was downbeat. I looked out the window at the Ferris wheel of the Great America amusement park revolving in the distance, then I turned back to Gordon and I asked, if we got kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? Gordon answered without hesitation, he would get us out of memories. I stared at him, numb, then said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back and do it ourselves? The route to survival. With that comment and with Gordon's encouragement, we started on a very difficult journey. To be completely honest about it, as I started to discuss the possibility of getting out of the memory chip business with some of my associates, I had a hard time getting the words out of my mouth without equivocation. It was just too difficult a thing to say. Intel equaled memories in all of our minds. How could we give up our identity? How could we exist as a company that was not in the memory business? It was close to being inconceivable. Saying it to Gordon was one thing, talking to other people and implementing it in earnest was another. Not only was I too tentative as I started discussing this course of action with colleagues, I was also talking to people who didn't want to hear what I meant. As I got more and more frustrated that people didn't want to hear what I couldn't get myself to say, I grew more blunt and more specific in my language. The more blunt and specific I got, the more resistance, both overt and covert, I ran into. So we debated endlessly. I remember at the end of a discussion asking one of our senior managers to write down what he understood our position to be on the subject. He was waffling as he struggled with the decision and I figured I could trap him with his own written memo. I failed. Months went by as we played these weird games. In the course of one of my visits to a remote Intel location, I had dinner with the local senior managers, as I usually do. What they wanted to talk about was my attitude toward memories. I wasn't ready to announce that we were getting out of the business yet because we were still in the early stages of wrestling with the implications of what getting out would mean. Among them, what work would we have for this very group of people afterward? Yet I couldn't get myself to pretend that nothing like this could ever happen. So I gave an ambivalent to negative answer, which this group immediately picked up on. One of them attacked me aggressively, asking, "Does it mean that you can conceive of Intel without being in the memory business?" I swallowed hard and said, "Yes, I guess I can." All hell broke loose. The company had a couple of beliefs that were as strong as religious dogmas. Both of them had to do with the importance of memories as the backbone of our manufacturing and sales activities. One was that memories were our technology drivers. What this phrase meant was that we always developed and refined our technologies on our memory products first because they were easier to test. Once the technology had been debugged on memories, we would apply it to microprocessors and other products. The other belief was the full product line dogma. According to this, our salesmen needed a full product line to do a good job in front of our customers. If they didn't have a full product line, the customer would prefer to do business with our competitors who did. Given the strength of these two beliefs, an open-minded, rational discussion about getting out of memories was practically impossible. What were we going to use for technology drivers? How were our salespeople going to do their jobs when they had an incomplete product family? So it was on that night at this Intel dinner I described above. The rest of the evening was spent going in circles around these two issues, the management group and I getting increasingly frustrated with each other. This was typical of discussions on the subject. In fact, the senior manager in charge of our memory business couldn't get with the program even after months of discussions. Eventually he was offered a different job and accepted it, and I started with his replacement by spelling out exactly what I wanted him to do: get us out of memories. By this time, having had months of frustrating discussions under my belt, I no longer had any difficulty making myself clear. Still, after the new person got acquainted with the situation, he took only half a step. He announced that we would do no further R&D on new products. However, he convinced me to finish what his group had in the works. In other words, he convinced me to continue to do R&D for a product that he and I both knew we had no plans to sell. I suppose that even though our minds were made up about where we were going, our emotions were still holding both of us back from full commitment to the new direction. I rationalized to myself that such a major change had to be accomplished in a number of smaller steps. But in a few months we came to the inevitable conclusion that this halfway decision was untenable, and we finally worked up our determination and clearly decided, not just in the management ranks but throughout the whole organization, that we were getting out of the memory business, once and for all. After all manner of gnashing of teeth, we told our sales force to notify our memory customers. This was one of the great bugaboos. How would our customers react? Would they stop doing business with us altogether now that we were letting them down? In fact, the reaction was, for all practical purposes, a big yawn. Our customers knew that we were not a very large factor in the market, and they had half figured that we would get out. Most of them had already made arrangements with other suppliers. In fact, when we informed them of the decision, some of them reacted with the comment, "It sure took you a long time." People who have no emotional stake in a decision can see what needs to be done sooner. I believe this has a great deal to do with why there is such a high turnover in the ranks of CEOs today. Every day, it seems, leaders who have been with the company for most of their working lives announce their departure, usually as the company is struggling through a period that has the looks of a strategic inflection point. More often than not, these CEOs are replaced by someone from the outside. I suspect that the people coming in are probably no better managers or leaders than the people they are replacing. They have only one advantage, but it may be crucial: unlike the person who has devoted his entire life to the company and therefore has a history of deep involvement in the sequence of events that led to the present mess, the new managers come unencumbered by such emotional involvement and therefore are capable of applying an impersonal logic to the situation. They can see things much more objectively than their predecessors did. If existing management want to keep their jobs when the basics of the business are undergoing profound change, they must adopt an outsider's intellectual objectivity. They must do what they need to do to get through the strategic inflection point unfettered by any emotional attachment to the past. That's what Gordon and I had to do when we figuratively went out the door, stomped out our cigarettes and returned to do the job. As we came back in that door, the main question we faced was this: if we are not doing memories, what should our future focus be? Microprocessors were the obvious candidate. We had now been supplying the key microprocessors for IBM-compatible PCs for nearly 5 years. We were the largest factor in the market. Furthermore, our next mainline microprocessor, the 386, was ready to go into production. As I mentioned, its development was based on a technology developed in the corner of an old production plant. It would really have done much better in our most modern plant in Oregon, but until now that place had been busy doing memory development. Getting out of the memory business gave us the opportunity to assign the group of developers in Oregon, who were arguably the best at Intel at this time, to the task of adapting their manufacturing process to build faster, cheaper, better 380 SIXs. So I went up to Oregon. On the one hand, these developers were worried about their future. On the other hand, they were memory developers whose interest in and attachment to microprocessors was not very strong. I gathered them all in an auditorium and made a speech. The theme of the speech was, "Welcome to the mainstream." I said that Intel's mainstream was going to be microprocessors. By signing up to do microprocessor development, they would be bearing the flag for Intel's mainline business. It actually went a lot better than I had expected. These people, like our customers, had known what was inevitable before we in senior management faced up to it. There was a measure of relief that they no longer had to work on something that the company wasn't fully committed to. This group, in fact, threw itself into microprocessor development, and they have done a bang-up job ever since. Elsewhere, however, the story was not so positive. These were very hard times and we were losing a lot of money. We had to lay off thousands of employees. We had no immediate use for the silicon fabrication plant where memories were made and had to shut it down. We also shut down assembly plants and testing plants that were involved with the production of memories. These also happened to be our oldest factories, situated in odd locations and too small for our business at this point anyway, so shutting them down gave us the opportunity to modernize our factory network. But that didn't make it any less painful. Looking back, it was through the memory business crisis and how we dealt with it that I learned the meaning of a strategic inflection point. It's a very personal experience. I learned how small and helpless you feel when facing a force that's 10x larger than what you are accustomed to. I experienced the confusion that engulfs you when something fundamental changes in the business, and I felt the frustration that comes when the things that worked for you in the past no longer do any good. I learned how desperately you want to run from dealing with even describing a new reality to close associates. And I experienced the exhilaration that comes from a set-jawed commitment to a new direction, unsure as that may be. Painful as it has all been, it turned me into a better manager. I learned some basic principles, too. I learned that the word point in strategic inflection point is something of a misnomer. It's not a point, it's a long, torturous struggle. In this case, the Japanese started beating us in the memory business in the early 80s. Intel's performance started to slump when the entire industry weakened in mid-1984. The conversation with Gordon Moore that I described occurred in mid-1985. It took until mid-1986 to implement our exit from memories. Then it took another year before we returned to profitability. Going through the whole strategic inflection point took us a total of 3 years. And while today, 10 years later, they now seem compressed to one short and intense period, at the time, those 3 years were long and arduous and wasteful. While we were fighting the inevitable, trying out all sorts of clever marketing approaches, looking for a niche that couldn't possibly exist in a commodity market, we were wasting time, getting deeper into red ink and ultimately forcing ourselves to take harsher actions to right things when we finally got around to taking action at all. While the realization of what we were facing was a flash of insight that took place in a single conversation, the work of implementing the consequences of that conversation went on for years. I also learned that strategic inflection points, painful as they are for all participants, provide an opportunity to break out of a plateau and catapult to a higher level of achievement. Had we not changed our business strategy, we would have been relegated to an immensely tough economic existence and, for sure, a relatively insignificant role in our industry. By making a forceful move, things turned out far better for us. What happened subsequently? The 386 became very, very successful, by far our most successful microprocessor to that point. Its success was greatly enhanced by the work of the former memory group in Oregon. We were no longer a semiconductor memory company. As we started to search for a new identity for the corporation, we realized that all of our efforts now were devoted to the microprocessor business. We decided to characterize ourselves as a microcomputer company. This started first in our public statements, literature, and advertising, but over the years, as the 386 became a phenomenal success, it took hold of the hearts and minds of our management and most of our employees. Eventually the outside world started to look at us that way too. By 1992, mostly owing to our success with microprocessors, we became the largest semiconductor company in the world, larger even than the Japanese companies that had beaten us in memories. And by now our identification with microprocessors is so strong that it's difficult for us to get noticed for our non-microprocessor products. Yet had we dithered longer, we could have missed our chance at all this. We might have vacillated between a heroic effort to hang on to our dwindling share of the memory business and an effort that might have been too weak to project us into the exploding microprocessor market. Had we stayed indecisive, we might have lost both. One last lesson, and this is a key one: while Intel's business changed and management was looking for clever memory strategies and arguing among themselves, trying to figure out how to fight an unwinnable war, men and women lower in the organization, unbeknownst to us, got us ready to execute the strategic turn that saved our necks and gave us a great future. Over time, more and more of our production resources were directed to the emerging microprocessor business, not as a result of any specific strategic direction by senior management but as a result of daily decisions by middle managers, the production planners and the finance people who sat around a table at endless production allocation meetings. Bit by bit, they allocated more and more of our silicon wafer production capacities to those lines which were more profitable, like microprocessors, by taking production capacity away from the money-losing memory business. Simply by doing their daily work, these middle managers were adjusting Intel's strategic posture. By the time we made the decision to exit the memory business, only 1 out of 8 silicon fabrication plants was producing memories. The exit decision had less drastic consequences as a result of the actions of our middle managers. This is not unusual. People in the trenches are usually in touch with impending changes early. Salespeople understand shifting customer demands before management does. Financial analysts are the earliest to know when the fundamentals of a business change. While management was kept from responding by beliefs that were shaped by our earlier successes, our production planners and financial analysts dealt with allocations and numbers in an objective world. For us senior managers, it too night crisis of an economic cycle and the sight of unrelenting red ink before we could summon up the gumption needed to execute a dramatic departure from our past. Were we unusual? I don't think so. I think Intel was a well-managed company with a strong corporate culture, outstanding employees, and a good track record. After all, we weren't quite 17 years old, and in those 17 years we had created several major business areas. We were good. But when we were caught up in a strategic inflection point, we almost missed it. We nearly became another Unisom, another MOSTEC, another Advanced Memory Systems. Signal or noise? How do we know whether a change signals a strategic inflection point? The only way is through the process of clarification that comes from broad and intensive debate. When is a change really a strategic inflection point? Changes take place in business all the time. Some are minor, some are major. Some are transitory, some represent the beginning of a new era. They all need to be dealt with, but they don't all represent strategic inflection points. How do you know what a certain set of changes represents? Put in another way, how can you tell the signal from the noise? Is X-ray technology a 10X force? Some years ago, key technologists at IBM told their counterparts at Intel and other companies that the Japanese semiconductor manufacturers were investing in gigantic and extremely expensive facilities for manufacturing semiconductors with even finer features than could be accomplished by ordinary techniques. These facilities would use X-rays instead of ordinary light to define the features of a chip. According to the IBM people, the Japanese had more than a dozen of these plants under construction. They feared that the Japanese investment in X-ray technology represented a fundamental change in the way semiconductors were built, a change by which the American producers could be left behind once and for all. If they were right, the X-ray approach would represent a 10X technology factor and lead to an inflection point that we might never recover from. IBM considered these developments a very major danger and decided to invest in X-ray equipment in a big way. Our people took this news very seriously. IBM technologists were extremely competent and their perception of the threat was ominous. Nor were they alone in this view. Nevertheless, after studying the issue, the Intel technologists decided that X-ray techniques were fraught with problems and that they were not production-worthy. Most importantly, they felt that our current technology could evolve to achieve ever finer features well into the future. The way IBM and Intel responded to the X-ray technology threat showed that one company deemed it signal, while the other classified it noise. We decided not to pursue the X-ray approach. 10 years later, it appears that we were right. As of this time of writing, to my knowledge, neither IBM nor the Japanese manufacturers are planning to use X-ray technology in manufacturing any time soon. In this case, competent and serious-minded people came to a different set of conclusions about a given set of facts. This is not at all uncommon. There simply is no surefire formula by which you can decide if something is signal or noise. But because there is no surefire formula, every decision you make should be carefully scrutinized and re-examined as time passes. 10 years ago, we decided that X-ray technology was not a 10X factor. However, we continued to watch it, looking to see if the threat grew, waned, or stayed the same. Think of the change in your environment, technological or otherwise, as a blip on your radar screen. You can't tell what that blip represents at first, but you keep watching radar scan after radar scan, looking to see if the object is approaching, what its speed is and what shape it takes as it comes closer. Even if it lingers on your periphery, you still keep an eye on it because its course and speed may change. So it is with X-ray technology. It is on our radar screen and has been for years. Today, we still don't think we need to invest in it. But a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, as we exhaust other means that are for now more cost-effective, the balance might shift and what we once correctly determined was noise might well emerge as a signal we had better pay heed to. These things are not cut and dried, and even if they were, things change. Therefore, you have to pay eternal attention to developments that could become a 10X factor in your business. Risk versus CISC. As potential 10X factors go, the X-ray technology issue was relatively simple. Technologists at IBM had one opinion, their counterparts at Intel had another. We did what our collective judgment indicated we should do. Things get a lot more complicated when the differences of opinion are not just between ourselves and others but when we argue inside the company as well. The story of the ferocious risk versus CISC debates, which continue to this day, provide a good example of such a situation. RISC and CISC are acronyms for arcane computer terms: reduced instruction set computing and complex instruction set computing. For our purposes, It's enough to know that they describe two different ways of designing computers and, therefore, microprocessors. The debate over their merits divided the computing industry and almost tore it apart. CISC was the older approach, RISC was a newer technique. CISC designs require a lot more transistors to achieve the same result that RISC chips can accomplish with fewer transistors. Intel's chips are based on the older CISC scheme. By the time other companies started to pursue RISC techniques in the late 80s, the then current Intel microprocessor, the 386, was on the market, and the next generation Intel microprocessor, the 486, was in development. The 486 was a higher performance, more advanced version of the same architecture that we used in the 386, it ran the same software but it ran it better. This was an extremely important consideration at Intel. We were, and are, determined that all our new microprocessors would be compatible with the software our customers bought for their earlier microprocessors. Some of our people took the position that the RISC approach represented a 10x improvement, a level of improvement that in the hands of others could threaten our core business. So, to hedge our bets, we put a big effort into developing a high-performance microprocessor based on RISC technology. This project had a major drawback, however. Even though the new RISC chip was faster and cheaper, it would have been incompatible with most of the software that was available in the marketplace. Compatibility of a product was and still is a big factor in making it popular, therefore the idea that we would come up with an incompatible chip was not an appealing one. To get under the management radar screen that guarded our compatibility dogma, the engineers and technical managers who believed RISC would be a better approach camouflaged their efforts and advocated developing their chip as an auxiliary one that would work with the 486. All along, of course, they were hoping that the power of their technology would propel their chip into a far more central role. In any event, the project proceeded and eventually gave birth to a new and very powerful microprocessor, the 1860. We now had two very powerful chips that we were introducing at just about the same time, the 486, largely based on CISC technology and compatible with all the PC software, and the 1860, based on RISC technology, which was very fast but compatible with nothing. We didn't know what to do. So we introduced both, figuring we'd let the marketplace decide. However, things were not that simple. Supporting a microprocessor architecture with all the necessary computer-related products, software, sales, and technical support takes enormous resources. Even a company like Intel had to strain to do an adequate job with just one architecture. And now we had two different and competing efforts, each demanding more and more internal resources. Development projects have a tendency to want to grow like the proverbial mustard seed. The fight for resources and for marketing attention, for example, when meeting with the customer, which processor should we highlight, led to internal debates that were fierce enough to tear apart our microprocessor organization. Meanwhile, our equivocation caused our customers to wonder what Intel really stood for, the 486 or the 1860. I was watching these developments with growing unease. The issue concerned the heart of our company, the microprocessor business that we had put our faith in and repositioned the company around when we abandoned the memory business just a few years earlier. It didn't involve factors that might or might not arise a decade from now, like X-ray technology. It demanded a decision immediately, and the decision was crucial. On the one hand, if the RISC trend represented a strategic inflection point and we didn't take appropriate action, our life as a microprocessor leader would be very short. On the other hand, the 380 SIX's fantastic momentum seemed sure to extend into the 486 and perhaps even to future generations of microprocessors. Should we abandon a good thing, which for now at least was a sure thing, and lower ourselves back down into a competitive battle with the other RISC architectures, a battle in which we had no particular advantage? Although I have a technical background, it is not in computer science and I was not that comfortable with the architectural issues involved. To be sure, we had lots of people who had the right background, but they had all split into warring camps, each camp 100% convinced of its own chip's supremacy. Meanwhile, our customers and other industry partners were not of one mind either. On the one hand, the CEO of Compaq, a major and very technically savvy customer of ours, leaned on us, on me, in particular, and encouraged us to put all our efforts into improving the performance of our older CISC line of microprocessors. He was convinced that the architecture had enough power in it to last the rest of the decade, and he was unhappy seeing us split our resources and spend lots of time and money on something that was of no use to Compaq. On the other hand, the key technology manager at Microsoft, the company that provided most of the software that our customers used in conjunction with our microprocessors, was encouraging us to move toward an 860 PC. As the head of one of our European customers told me, "Andy, this is like the fashion business. We need something new." When the 486 was formally introduced, the reaction of the customer community was extremely positive. I remember sitting at the product introduction in Chicago with a virtual who's who of the computer manufacturing world, all of whom showed up to announce their readiness to build 486-based computers, and thinking, risk or no risk, how could we possibly not put all our efforts into supporting this momentum? After this event, the debates were over and we refocused our efforts on the 486 and its successors. Looking back at these debates 6 years after the fact, I shake my head about how I could have even considered walking away from our traditional technology that then had, and still has, phenomenal headroom and momentum. Today, in fact, the advantages of RISC technology over CISC technology are much smaller than they appeared then. Yet at that time we were seriously considering a major shift of resources. Is it or isn't it? Sometimes the event that signals a strategic inflection point is dramatically clear. I doubt that it required a lot of study to conclude that the modified final judgment that led to the breakup of the old AT&T was a monumental event. It probably was also pretty clear that when the FDA was formed and the Truth in Labeling Act was passed, the world of patent medicine changed once and for all. There was no question that these events represented key changes in the environment of the businesses that operated under their influence. Most of the time it's not like that. Most strategic inflection points, instead of coming in with a bang, approach on little cat feet. They are often not clear until you can look at the events in retrospect. Later, when you ask yourself when you first had an inkling that you were facing a strategic inflection point, your recollections are about a trivial sign hinting that the competitive dynamics had changed. In the earlier story about memories, Intel visitors to Japan came back with the report that Japanese businessmen who had previously been very respectful of us now seemed to look at us with a newfound derision. Something changed, it's different now, people said when they returned from Japan. And this comment and observations like it heightened our awareness that a real change was upon us. So how do you know whether a change signals a strategic inflection point? Ask these questions to attempt to distinguish signal from noise. Is your key competitor about to change? First, figure out who your key competitor is by asking a hypothetical question that I call the silver bullet test. It works like this: if you had just one bullet in a figurative pistol, whom among your many competitors would you save it for? Asked point blank, this question usually provokes a visceral response, and I find that people can normally give an answer without much hesitation. When the answer to this question stops being as crystal clear as it used to be and some of your people direct the silver bullet to competitors who didn't merit this kind of attention previously, it's time to sit up and pay special attention. When the importance of your competitors shirts, it is often a sign that something significant is going on. In an analogous fashion, you should ask, is your key competitor about to change? Does the company that in past years mattered the most to you and your business seem less important today? Does it look like another company is about to eclipse them? If so, it may be a sign of shirting industry dynamics. Do people seem to be losing it around you? Does it seem that people who for years had been very competent have suddenly gotten decoupled from what really matters? Think about it. You and your management have both been selected by the evolutionary forces of your business to be at the top of your organization. Your genes were right for the original business. But if key aspects of the business shift around you, the very process of genetic selection that got you and your associates where you are might retard your ability to recognize the new trends. A sign of this might be that all of a sudden some people don't seem to get it. Conversely, it may be that you yourself are often inclined to shake your head in confusion. When they don't get it or you don't get it, it may not be because of encroaching age, it may be because it has changed around you. Helpful Cassandras. The Cassandras in your organization are a consistently helpful element in recognizing strategic inflection points. As you might remember, Cassandra was the priestess who foretold the fall of Troy. Likewise, there are people who are quick to recognize impending change and cry out an early warning. Although they can come from anywhere in the company, Cassandras are usually in middle management, often they work in the sales organization. They usually know more about upcoming change than the senior management because they spend so much time outdoors where the winds of the real world blow in their faces. In other words, their genes have not been selected to achieve perfection in the old way. Because they are on the front lines of the company, the Cassandras also feel more vulnerable to danger than do senior managers in their more or less bolstered corporate headquarters. Bad news has a much more immediate impact on them personally. Lost sales affect a salesperson's commission. Technology that never makes it to the marketplace disrupts an engineer's career. Therefore, they take the warning signs more seriously. The other night, I checked my electronic mailbox and found a message from our sales manager in charge of the Asia-Pacific region. He passed on some breaking news from his area that had to do with a potential competitive element. His story was a familiar enough scenario, and yet as he began to talk about the new item, his tone was quite concerned, almost scared. I don't mean to be an alarmist, and I know that situations like this come up all the time, but this one really concerns me, he wrote. He was in no position to suggest a course of action, he was just asking me to pay attention to this development and urging me to take it seriously. My immediate reaction was to shrug off his news. I feel much safer back here in California than he does in enemy territory. But is my perspective the right one? Or is his? After all, being there doesn't automatically make him right in his assessment. I could claim to have a better overall perspective on things. Yet I have learned to respect changes in the tone of messages from people in the field. I will watch further developments of this news item more carefully than I would have otherwise, and, in fact, I have since decided to initiate a broader study of its potential implications. You don't have to seek these Cassandras out. If you are in management, they will find you. Like somebody who sells a product that he is passionate about, they will sell their concern to you with a passion. Don't argue with them, even though it's time-consuming. Do your best to hear them out, to learn what they know and to understand why it affects them the way it does. Classify the time you spend listening to them as an investment in learning what goes on at the distant periphery of your business, whether you think of distances in geographical or technological terms. Think of it this way: when spring comes, snow melts first at the periphery, because that's where it's most exposed. Factoring in the news from the periphery is an important contribution to the process of sorting out signal from noise. There is a fine distinction here. When I say, learn what goes on at the periphery of your business, it means something different than if I had said, learn what goes on in your business. In the ordinary course of business, I talk with the general manager, with the sales manager, with the manufacturing manager. I learn from them what goes on in the business. But they will give me a perspective from a position that is not terribly far from my own. When I absorb news or information coming from people who are geographically distant or who are several levels below me in the organization, I will triangulate on business issues with their view, which comes from a completely different perspective. This will bring insights that I would not likely get from my ordinary contacts. Of course, you can't spend all of your time listening to random inputs. But you should be open to them. As you keep doing it, you will develop a feel for whose views are apt to contain gems of information and a sense of who will take advantage of your openness to clutter you with noise. Over time, then, you can adjust your receptivity accordingly. Sometimes a Cassandra brings not tidings of a disaster but a new way of looking at things. During the height of Intel's RISC versus CISC debate, when I was most confused, our chief technologist asked to see me. He sat down and methodically took me through his point of view while at the same time representing the other side's argument in the most objective way that I heard. His knowledge and insights made up for my own lack of self-confidence and expertise in this area and helped me listen to the ongoing debates with a better grasp of what I was hearing. Although this encounter did not lead me to a firm position, it helped me form a framework in which to better evaluate everyone else's arguments. In the case of Intel's exit from the memory business, how did Intel, the memory company, get to where only one factory out of 8 was producing memory chips by the mid-1980s, making our exit from memories less cataclysmic? It got there by the autonomous actions of the finance and production planning people, who sat around painstakingly allocating wafer production capacity month by month, moving silicon wafers from products where they seemed wasteful. Memories were the prime example of this to other products which seemed to generate better margins, such as microprocessors. These people didn't have the authority to get us out of memories, but they had the authority to fine-tune the production allocation process by lots of little steps. Over the course of many months, their actions made it easier to eventually pull the plug on our memory participation. Peter Drucker quotes a definition of an entrepreneur as someone who moves resources from areas of lower productivity and yield to areas of higher productivity and yield. That's what a properly motivated and intelligent middle manager will do with resources under his or her command. The resources can range from wafer allocation for a production planner to how a salesperson schedules his or her efforts and energy. Are these random actions on the part of middle management, or are they strategy being formed and executed? To be sure, they don't seem strategic at first glance, but I think they are. Avoiding the trap of the first version. Helpful Cassandras are quick to notice the first signs of 10x forces, but those signs are often mixed in with symptoms of forces that might appear to be 10x but aren't. For instance, is the internet really that big a deal? Are we going to do all our banking electronically? Is interactive television going to transform our lives? Are digital media going to transform the entertainment industry? The first thing you should realize is that everybody with a gadget hawks and hypes it and consciously or unconsciously works double time to make their product as important as possible. Under the circumstances, it's only natural to be suspicious, and so you should be. The second thing is that, when you explore these developments firsthand, you'll discover that mostly they aren't what they're cracked up to be. In the early days, getting from one place to another on the internet took forever, and when you got there, more often than not, you found a stale marketing brochure. Electronic banking is still a clumsy way to replace a stamp. And interactive television seems to have vanished even before the ink dried on the mega announcements. On the other hand, don't shut off your radar screens and go on about your business, discounting everything even if at first it seems quite crummy. A danger in assessing the significance of changes lies in what I call the trap of the first version. In 1984, when Apple introduced the Macintosh, I thought it was a ridiculous toy. Among other weaknesses I saw in it, it didn't have a hard disk. At the time, all PCs already had one, and it was excruciatingly slow. Because of these two factors, the Mac's graphical interface struck me as more of a nuisance than a significant advantage. The first implementation of the Mac blinded me to the far more important features that came with graphical interfaces, like the fact that they brought with them a uniformity for all the application programs that were based on them. You learned one and you learned them all. But I didn't see through the problems of the first version to perceive the beauty of the technology that lay beneath them. In 1991, when Apple started to talk about the handheld computing devices called Personal Digital Assistants, or PDAs, a lot of people both inside and outside Intel considered them a 10x force capable of restructuring the PC industry. PDAs could do to PCs what PCs were doing to mainframes, Many said. Not wanting to be blind to this possibility, we made a very substantial external investment and started a major internal effort to ensure that we would participate in any PDA wave in a big way. Then Apple's Newton came out in 1993 and was promptly criticized for its failings. What does this say about the PDA phenomenon? Is it less of a 10x force because its first instantiation was disappointing? When you think about it, first versions of most things usually are. Lisa, the first commercial computer with a graphical user interface and the predecessor of the Mac, did not receive good acceptance. Neither did the first version of Windows, which was considered an inferior product for years. DOS with a pretty face, as many called it. Yet graphical user interfaces in general, and Windows in particular, have become 10x forces shaping the industry. My point is that you can't judge the significance of strategic inflection points by the quality of the first version. You need to draw on your experience. Perhaps you remember your reaction to the first PC you ever saw. It probably didn't strike you as a revolutionary device. So it is with the internet. Now, as you stare at your computer screen that's connected to the internet, waiting for a World Wide Web page to slowly materialize, let your imagination flow a bit. What might this experience be like if transmission speed doubled? Or better yet, if it were improved by 10x? What might the content look like if professional editors rather than amateurs created it, not as a sideline but as their main occupation? You might extrapolate the evolution of this phenomenon by remembering how rapidly PCs evolved and improved. As you consider this or any new device, your answer may be that, even if it were 10x better, it wouldn't interest you as a consumer. Even if a company actually supplied it, it wouldn't change the silver bullet test and it wouldn't rearrange your complementars. Life would go on as before, just with one more gadget. But if your instincts suggest that a 10x improvement could make this capability exciting or threatening, you may very well be looking at the beginning of what is going to be a strategic inflection point. Consequently, you must discipline yourself to think things through and separate the quality of the early versions from the longer-term potential and significance of a new product or technology. Debate. The most important tool in identifying a particular development as a strategic inflection point is a broad and intensive debate. This debate should involve technical discussions, for example, is RISC inherently 10x faster, marketing discussions, is it a fashion fling or is it a business, and considerations of strategic repercussions, how will it affect our microprocessor business if we make a dramatic move, how will it affect it if we don't? The more complex the issues are, the more levels of management should be involved because people from different levels of management bring completely different points of view and expertise to the table, as well as different genetic makeups. The debate should involve people outside the company, customers, and partners who not only have different areas of expertise but also have different interests. They bring their own biases and their own interests into the picture, as Compaq's CEO did when he urged us to continue with CISC development, but that's okay, a business can succeed only if it serves the interests of outside parties as well. This kind of debate is daunting because it takes a lot of time and a lot of intellectual urges. It also takes a lot of guts. It takes courage to enter into a debate you may lose, in which weaknesses in your knowledge may be exposed and in which you may draw the disapproval of your co-workers for taking an unpopular viewpoint. Nevertheless, this comes with the territory, and when it comes to identifying a strategic inflection point, unfortunately, there are no shortcuts. If you are in senior management, don't feel you're being a wimp for taking the time to solicit the views, convictions, and passions of the experts. No statues will be carved for corporate leaders who charge off on the wrong side of a complex decision. Take your time until the news you hear starts to repeat what you've already heard, and until a conviction builds up in your own gut. If you are in middle management, don't be a wimp. Don't sit on the sidelines waiting for the senior people to make a decision so that later on you can criticize them over a beer. My God, how could they be so dumb? Your time for participating is now. You owe it to the company and you owe it to yourself. Don't justify holding back by saying that you don't